My name is Chloe. I am 31 years old and I am a pediatric oncology nurse. Every single day, I hold the hands of terrified parents and administer chemotherapy to children who possess more bravery in their little fingers than most adults have in their entire bodies. My job requires infinite patience, profound empathy, and an unbreakable spirit. I am trained to spot the smallest signs of pain in my patients, to read the subtle shifts in a child's breathing or the tight clench of their jaw. Yet for 2 years, I used every ounce of that professional training to hide my own pain. I covered every bruise, I memorized every excuse, and I fiercely defended the very man who was breaking me apart piece by piece. My husband, Julian, was a charismatic, brilliant real estate developer who presented himself to the world as a prince. But behind the heavy oak doors of our custom-built mansion, he was a monster. I spent 2 years shrinking myself to survive him. Then, my uncle noticed one dark mark beneath my sleeve. He did not yell. He did not confront Julian. He said absolutely nothing. He just waited until sunrise when sirens filled our pristine driveway and my abuser finally dropped to his knees. Before I tell you how my uncle's silence systematically dismantled my husband's entire life, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with stories of surviving and reclaiming your power. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one of your comments, and I love connecting with you all. Now let me take you back to the night the final countdown began. It was a Friday evening in late October, the kind of crisp, sharp night that makes the air feel thin. I had just finished a brutal 12-hour shift at the hospital. We had lost a patient that morning, a sweet 7-year-old boy who loved dinosaurs. My heart was completely shattered. My feet were swollen and my scrubs smelled of clinical antiseptic and exhaustion. All I wanted was to crawl into a hot shower and cry until I had nothing left. But I did not have that luxury. I was married to Julian, and Julian was hosting a high society dinner party for his most important investors. I walked through the front door of our sprawling 6,000 square foot modern home. Julian had designed it himself. It was all floor-to-ceiling glass, cold gray stone, and sharp angles. It was beautiful, but it felt like living inside a museum display case. There was nowhere to hide. Julian was standing in the foyer adjusting his tailored Italian suit in the mirror. He did not ask how my day was. He did not ask why my eyes were red. He just checked his gold watch and sighed a sharp, impatient sound that immediately made my stomach knot with familiar dread. "You are late, Chloe." His voice was smooth, like velvet wrapped around a brick. "The caterers are setting up the raw bar. The guests arrive in exactly 40 minutes. You need to shower, fix your face, and put on the sapphire dress. The one that shows off the necklace I bought you." I swallowed hard, pushing down the grief of my day. "I'm sorry," I whispered. We had a code blue at the end of my shift. I could not just leave. Julian turned to me, his handsome face perfectly blank. "I do not care about the hospital, Chloe. I care about this dinner." These men are funding my next commercial complex. They need to see a perfect home, a perfect host, and a perfect smiling wife. Do you understand? Do not embarrass me tonight. I nodded quickly. I rushed upstairs, stripped off my scrubs, and stepped into scalding water. I had 15 minutes to transform from a grieving nurse into a radiant socialite. I put on the heavy sapphire dress. I applied thick foundation to cover the dark circles under my eyes, and I clasped the heavy diamond necklace around my throat. It felt like a collar. By the time the doorbell rang, I was standing beside Julian in the foyer, plastering a bright, flawless smile on my face. The guests poured in. There were 12 of them. Wealthy venture capitalists, local politicians, and real estate moguls, all accompanied by their perfectly manicured wives. Julian was in his element. He was magnetic. He poured expensive champagne, told witty anecdotes, and laughed loudly. Watching him, you would think he was the most generous, warm-hearted man alive. He put his hand on the small of my back, a gesture that looked protective to the guests. But his fingers pressed into my spine, just hard enough to remind me who was in control. The evening moved into the formal dining room. The table was set with crystal glasses and heavy silver cutlery. The conversation flowed around me, mostly centered on golf handicaps, investment portfolios, and zoning laws. I sat quietly smiling, nodding, and speaking only when spoken to. So Chloe, one of the investors, a loud man named Richard, called out from across the table. Julian tells us you are still working at the hospital. Why on earth would you subject yourself to that when your husband is about to close a $50 million deal? You should be spending your days at the country club enjoying the life he provides. I felt my cheeks flush. I love my job, I said softly. The children I work with, they need someone who cares. It is incredibly fulfilling to help them. Julian chuckled a rich, patronizing sound. He reached over and patted my hand. Chloe has such a bleeding heart. I keep telling her she does not need to work herself to the bone for a nurse's salary, but she insists on playing the martyr. It is cute, really, but completely unnecessary. The table laughed. They all laughed at me. I looked down at my plate, my jaw clenched tight. He had reduced my entire life's calling, my dedication to dying children, to a cute, unnecessary hobby. But I could not defend myself. I knew the rules. Never contradict Julian in public. Never make him look bad. The first course was cleared. We were scheduled to have the main entree, a delicate sea bass, served at exactly 8:30. I glanced at the antique clock on the wall. It was 8:40. The caterers were 10 minutes behind schedule. Julian noticed. Of course he noticed. His eyes flicked to the clock, then to the kitchen door, and finally to me. The warmth completely vanished from his expression, replaced by a cold, flat stare that made the blood freeze in my veins. He leaned toward me, his lips barely moving as he whispered, "Check on the food." Now. I excused myself from the table, offering a polite apology to the guests. I walked quickly down the hall and pushed through the swinging door into the massive chef's kitchen. The catering team was in a frantic scramble. The head chef was barking orders, trying to plate 12 intricate dishes at once. "Is everything all right?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "We are 10 minutes behind. My husband is getting impatient." The chef looked up, stressed and sweating. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Myers." The oven temperature dropped unexpectedly. "We are plating right now. Just 2 more minutes, I swear." Before I could reply, the kitchen door swung open again. Julian stepped inside. He let the door swing shut behind him, cutting off the sounds of the laughing guests in the dining room. The atmosphere in the kitchen instantly turned suffocating. The caterers froze, sensing the immediate shift in the air. Julian ignored the chef. He walked straight toward me. His face was a mask of terrifying calm. He did not raise his voice. He did not yell. He never did. He stepped directly into my personal space, forcing me to back up until my spine hit the cold granite of the kitchen island. "What is the delay, Chloe?" he asked softly. I stammered, my heart hammering against my ribs. The oven temperature dropped. "They are plating now, Julian. Just 2 minutes." Julian smiled, a chilling, empty movement of his lips. He reached out and wrapped his large hand around my upper arm. To anyone glancing over, it might have looked like an affectionate touch, but his thumb found the soft flesh of my inner bicep, and his fingers dug in with a sudden, vicious, agonizing force. The pain was blinding. I gasped, my eyes watering instantly, but I clamped my mouth shut. I knew better than to make a sound. "I asked you to manage one simple thing tonight." He whispered, his face inches from mine. "One dinner. One schedule, and you humiliate me in front of the most important men in this city. You make me look like a man who cannot even control his own household. Julian." "Please." I choked out tears, threatening to spill over my carefully applied makeup. "You are hurting me." His grip tightened, grinding my muscle against the bone. He was leaving a mark. I knew it. He always made sure to bruise me in places my scrubs would cover. My ribs, my thighs, my upper arms. Places the world would never see. "You are nothing without me, Chloe." He hissed, his breath hot against my ear. "Do not ever forget that. You are a glorified servant playing house in a mansion I built. Now dry your pathetic eyes, get out there, and serve the dessert yourself if you have to." He released my arm abruptly. I stumbled slightly, clutching the counter to keep my balance. My arm was throbbing with a sickening, radiating heat. Julian straightened his suit jacket, smoothed his tie, and instantly rearranged his features into the charming, generous host. He pushed through the swinging door, and I heard his booming, cheerful voice greet the dining room. I stood in the kitchen, trembling uncontrollably. The catering staff was staring at me in horrified silence. They had seen it all, but like everyone else in Julian's world, they were paid to look away. The head chef quickly averted his eyes and went back to plating the sea bass. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes, forcing the tears back. I could not cry. If I went back out there with ruined makeup, Julian's punishment later would be infinitely worse. I smoothed down the fabric of my sapphire dress. I rolled my shoulders back. I plastered that bright, flawless, dead smile back onto my face, and I walked out of the kitchen carrying a tray of plates. For the next 2 hours, I played the perfect wife. I served dessert. I laughed at Richard's terrible jokes. I kept the wine glasses full. Every time I reached across the table, a bolt of white-hot pain shot up my arm. I could feel the bruise blooming under my skin, turning dark and ugly, but I kept smiling. I was a professional at masking pain. I did it at the hospital, and I did it here. Julian watched me from the head of the table. Every time our eyes met, he gave me a slow, approving nod. It was a silent communication that chilled me to the bone. He was proud of how well he had trained me. He was proud of my compliance. Finally, mercifully, the evening came to an end. It was past midnight. The guests began gathering their coats in the foyer. There were loud farewells, handshakes, and promises of future golf games. "Thank you so much for a wonderful evening, Chloe," Richard's wife said, kissing my cheek. "Your home is just stunning. You are a very lucky woman." "Thank you," I replied, my voice completely hollow. "Have a safe drive home." Julian stood by the open front door, shaking hands and waving as the luxury cars pulled out of our long driveway. I stood beside him, rubbing my hands together to keep them from shaking. The crisp autumn air drifted in from outside, but it did not make me feel awake. It just made me feel cold. We watched the taillights of the last car disappear down the private road. The silence that fell over the property was heavy and absolute. Julian closed the heavy oak door. The sound echoed through the massive foyer. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached up and turned the brass deadbolt. The loud metallic click sounded like a prison cell locking shut. He did not turn around immediately. He stood facing the door for a long, agonizing moment. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. I knew what the click of that deadbolt meant. The audience was gone. The performance was over. We were completely alone. Julian slowly turned to face me. The charming host was entirely gone. His eyes were dark flat and devoid of anything remotely human. He looked at my throbbing arm, then up to my face. He smiled. A cold, terrifying, predatory smile. "You really thought 10 minutes late was acceptable? Did not you?" he said softly, his voice dropping into a deadly quiet register. "I think we need to go upstairs and have a serious conversation about your complete lack of respect for my time." He took a step towards me. I backed away, my heels scraping against the marble floor. There was nowhere to run. There was no one to call. I was locked inside a glass cage with a monster, and there was no way out. Or so I thought. The morning sun filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our master bedroom felt offensively bright. It was barely 6 in the morning, and the house was dead silent. I stood perfectly still in front of the massive double vanity in the master bathroom, gripping the edges of the cold marble counter. Every single breath I took sent a sharp, radiating ache through my ribs. My right arm felt heavy and hot. I slowly peeled off my silk robe and looked at my reflection in the mirror. The bruise on my inner bicep had blossomed into a sickening tapestry of deep purple and dark yellow. It was perfectly shaped like the pads of his fingers. Julian always knew exactly how much pressure to apply to leave a mark that would last for weeks. I opened my makeup drawer and pulled out a heavy-duty theatrical concealer. It was a brand used to cover tattoos. I'd bought it online a year ago, and it had become the most important tool in my daily survival kit. As a nurse, I understood the biology of a bruise. I knew how the blood pooled under the skin and how the hemoglobin broke down into those ugly greenish-yellow hues. I used a color-correcting primer, first neutralizing the dark purple with a thick layer of orange pigment. Then, I carefully blended the flesh-toned concealer over it, tapping the edges with a damp sponge so it would look natural under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital. It took me 20 minutes to erase the physical evidence of what my husband had done to me the night before. I had to do my ribs next. He had shoved me hard against the doorframe after the deadbolt clicked shut, punishing me for the caterers being 10 minutes late. The skin over my left rib cage was tender to the touch, but I covered that too, just in case my scrubs rode up while I was lifting a patient. I had to be perfect. I had to be an invisible ghost in my own tragedy. I slipped into my navy blue scrubs, smoothing the fabric down with trembling hands. My shift at the pediatric oncology ward started at 7:30. Usually the hospital was my sanctuary. It was the only place where I had value, where I was respected, where the pain I dealt with was clinical and treatable. But today, I just felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I opened the bathroom door, quietly praying that Julian was still asleep. If I could just make it down the stairs and out to my car without waking him, I would have 12 hours of peace. But as I stepped into the hallway, the smell of expensive dark roast coffee and expensive cologne hit me like a physical blow. Julian was awake. He was standing at the end of the hallway, leaning casually against the banister. He was already dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his hair flawlessly styled. He looked like the cover of a business magazine. He looked like a prince. He looked nothing like the monster who had pinned me against a wall just 6 hours earlier. He held a ceramic coffee mug in one hand and a thick manila folder in the other. When he saw me, he smiled. It was that bright, charismatic smile he used on his investors. It made the blood freeze in my veins. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, his voice smooth and warm. I forced my facial muscles to lift into a reciprocal smile. "Good morning, Julian," I replied, keeping my voice even. "I need to get to the hospital. Traffic on the interstate is going to be heavy today." He stepped into the center of the hallway, effectively blocking my path to the stairs. The house suddenly felt suffocatingly small. He took a slow sip of his coffee and let his eyes wander over my scrubs. "I know you are in a rush," he said casually, "but I need 5 minutes of your time. We have some paperwork to finalize for the new commercial development project downtown." My stomach plummeted. Julian was always working on a new development project. He bought dilapidated commercial properties, gutted them, and turned them into luxury retail spaces. To the outside world, he was a self-made real estate mogul worth tens of millions, but I knew the truth about his finances. I was the one who saw the endless shell companies, the offshore limited liability corporations, the complex webs of debt he spun to keep his empire afloat. He lived his life entirely on leverage, and over the past 2 years, he had increasingly used my financial identity to secure that leverage. Before I met Julian, I was incredibly proud of my financial independence. I had worked through nursing school, paying my own tuition, working night shifts, and eating cheap ramen to avoid student loans. By the time I was 28, I had zero debt, a healthy savings account, and a pristine credit score of over 800. Julian had courted me with lavish dinners and expensive gifts, presenting himself as a man of unlimited resources. But once we were married, the narrative changed. He told me his wealth was tied up in corporate equity and real estate assets. He claimed he needed liquid cash and pristine personal credit to secure the best interest rates for short-term construction loans. Slowly, systematically, he began draining my resources. "What kind of paperwork, Julian?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to control it. He opened the manila folder and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents clipped together. "It is just a standard commercial loan guarantee," he said, brushing off the question like it was a minor annoyance. "The bank is being ridiculous about liquidity requirements for the new plaza project. I have $5 million in equity locked in the waterfront property, but they want a personal guarantor with a clean debt-to-income ratio to co-sign the bridge loan. It is a mere formality, Chloe. The loan will be cleared out by the limited liability company the minute the construction phase is finished next quarter." I stared at the thick stack of paper in his hands. The last time he asked me to co-sign a loan, it was for $50,000. He had sworn it would be paid off in a month. It took 6 months, and I had to field aggressive calls from the bank while he ignored their notices. "How much is this one for?" I asked, my throat dry. He sighed heavily, rolling his eyes like I was a stubborn child refusing to eat vegetables. "Does it really matter, Chloe? I told you it is a formality. You just need to sign on the highlighted lines." "How much, Julian?" I repeated, digging my fingernails into the palms of my hands to keep myself grounded. $250,000, he said flatly. The number echoed in the silent hallway. $250,000. It was more than I made in 3 years as a nurse. It was a staggering, crippling amount of debt. I felt the air leave my lungs. "Julian, I cannot sign that," I whispered, taking a step back. "I cannot take on $250,000 in debt. We already have the primary mortgage on this house in my name because your business accounts were structured too aggressively for the underwriter. I cannot sleep at night worrying about this. I am exhausted. I work 60-hour weeks at the hospital to pay for our groceries and utility bills because your money is always tied up. I cannot do this." The charismatic smile vanished from his face instantly. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. The warm, handsome husband was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating predator I feared more than death. He slowly placed his coffee mug on the hallway console table. He did not slam it. He set it down with deliberate, terrifying precision. He took one step toward me, then another. I backed up instinctively until my shoulder blades hit the wall. There was nowhere else to go. Julian leaned in close. He placed his hands flat against the wall on either side of my head, trapping me completely. His face was mere inches from mine. I could smell the mint of his toothpaste mixed with the dark roast coffee. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice when he wanted to break me. "You are going to sign these papers, Chloe," he whispered, his voice a soft, deadly hiss. "You are going to sign them right now because you are my wife, and it is your duty to support my business. Do you understand me?" Tears pricked the corners of my eyes. "Julian, please," I begged, my voice cracking. "I am terrified. If this project fails, the bank will come after me. My wages will be garnished. I will lose my nursing license if I am forced into bankruptcy. Please do not make me do this. I have given you everything I have." He shifted his weight, and suddenly his left forearm came up, pressing hard against my collarbone. He pinned me against the wall, the pressure cutting off my breath, just enough to make me panic. The fresh bruise on my ribcage screamed in agony as I struggled to twist away. "You have given me nothing," he sneered, his eyes dark and empty. "You are a glorified bedpan cleaner, making a pathetic salary. Everything you have this house, the car you drive, the clothes on your back, exists because I allow it to exist. I built this life for you. Your pristine little credit score is the only useful thing you bring to this marriage. Do not play the victim with me, Chloe. You are nothing without me. You are a small, insignificant little nurse, and if you ever try to humiliate me or deny me again, I will make sure you lose a lot more than your nursing license." He pushed his forearm harder against my collarbone. I gasped for air, my hands frantically grasping at his sleeve. "Okay." I choked out tears spilling hot and fast down my cheeks, ruining the careful makeup I had applied just 20 minutes earlier. "Okay, Julian, I will sign it. Please let me go." He held me there for one more agonizing second, letting the fear completely saturate my mind. Then he released me, stepping back and smoothing his suit jacket as if nothing had happened. He picked up the manila folder and a silver pen from the console table and shoved them into my trembling hands. "Sign where I highlighted," he commanded, his voice brisk and professional again. "And fix your makeup before you leave. You look hysterical." I leaned against the wall, gasping for air, trying to calm my racing heart. I flipped through the heavy pages of the commercial loan agreement. The legal jargon swam before my eyes. I could not focus on the words. All I could focus on was survival. I needed to get out of this house. I needed to get to the hospital where it was safe, where there were other people, where he could not corner me in a hallway and crush my collarbone. I blindly flipped to the signature pages. My hand shook violently as I pressed the silver pen to the paper. I signed my name 3 times. Chloe Myers, Chloe Myers, Chloe Myers. I traded my financial future, my security, and my peace of mind just for the chance to walk out the front door and breathe freely for 12 hours. I handed the folder back to him. He took it without looking at me. "Have a good shift," he said casually, turning his back and walking down the stairs toward his home office. I practically ran to my car. I locked the doors the moment I sat in the driver's seat, resting my forehead against the steering wheel and letting the tears flow freely. I cried until my chest ached. Then I pulled down the sun visor, wiped my face, reapplied my concealer, and drove to the hospital. By the time I walked through the sliding glass doors of the oncology ward, I had shoved the terror deep down into a tightly sealed box in my mind. I put on my compassionate nurse smile. I checked charts. I administered medication. I held the hands of frightened parents. I did my job perfectly, because my job was the only thing I had left that felt real. The morning passed in a blur of clinical routine. It was around 1 in the afternoon when things finally quieted down. Most of the children were resting after lunch, and the nurse's station was relatively peaceful. I sat at a computer terminal updating patient records. My cell phone vibrated in the pocket of my scrubs. I pulled it out, expecting a text message from a coworker. Instead, the screen displayed an incoming call from an unknown number. I normally ignored unknown numbers, but something made me answer it. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice low. "Hello, is this Chloe Myers?" asked a professional female voice on the other end of the line. "Yes, this is she. Good afternoon, Mrs. Myers. My name is Sarah, and I am calling from the Fraud Prevention and Wire Transfer Department at First National Bank. We are reaching out regarding a massive transaction initiated on your primary joint checking account this morning. We just need verbal authorization from the primary account holder before we release the funds." I frowned, staring blankly at the computer screen in front of me. "I do not understand," I said, my heart beginning to pick up a nervous rhythm. "What transaction?" "I did not initiate any transfers today. I have been at work since 7:30 this morning." The representative paused, and I could hear the sound of a keyboard clacking on her end. "Well, Mrs. Myers, a wire transfer request was submitted through your online banking portal at 10:15 this morning. Because the amount exceeds our standard daily limits for instant processing, it was flagged for manual review and verbal confirmation. How much is the transfer for?" I asked, a cold sweat breaking out across the back of my neck. The representative read the number in a crisp, clear voice. "It is an outgoing wire transfer in the amount of $250,000 being routed to an external account held by a wellness brand limited liability company. We just need you to verify that this is an authorized transaction before we clear the funds." The blood drained from my face. The hospital corridor around me seemed to tilt and spin. $250,000. That was the exact amount of the commercial loan I had been forced to co-sign just hours earlier. But Julian had said the loan was for a commercial real estate development project. He had said the bank required a guarantor for a bridge loan. He never said anything about transferring the cash directly into a checking account and then wiring it out to a wellness brand. I did not own a wellness brand. Julian did not own a wellness brand. I was gripping the edge of the nurse's station desk so tightly, my knuckles were completely white. The carefully constructed wall I had built to survive the morning was crumbling to dust. "Mrs. Myers," the bank representative prompted gently. "Are you still there? We just need to know if you authorize this transfer." I opened my mouth to speak, but my throat was entirely closed. If I said no, Julian would know I had blocked the transaction. He would be waiting for me when I got home. The deadbolt would click shut, and the consequences would be infinitely worse than a bruised bicep or a pinned collarbone. If I said yes, I was willingly participating in whatever financial nightmare he was orchestrating. I was trapped. I was completely, utterly trapped in a web of debt and terror, and the true nightmare had only just begun. The drive from the hospital to our house usually took 20 minutes. But that afternoon, it felt like a blur of gray pavement and flashing brake lights. My hands gripped to the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles ached with a dull, radiating pain. $250,000. The number echoed in my mind, drumming a relentless, terrifying beat against my skull. I had co-signed a commercial bridge loan that morning, under the threat of physical violence, believing it was for a critical real estate development. Now that exact staggering amount was being wired to an unknown wellness brand. Julian had lied to me. He had used my pristine credit and my years of desperate financial discipline to secure a mountain of debt, and he was funneling the cash somewhere else entirely. The panic in my chest was a living, breathing thing, wrapping its cold fingers around my lungs. I pulled into our long, pristine driveway, expecting to find Julian's sleek black sports car parked in its usual spot. Instead, I saw a bright yellow moving truck backed up to the guest house. Two men in heavy work boots were carrying a white leather sofa up the front steps. Parked right in the middle of the driveway, blocking my path, was a brand new, gleaming white Range Rover. I threw my old sedan into park and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. The front door of the main house swung open and Julian stepped out onto the porch. He was wearing casual designer clothes, looking completely relaxed and perfectly put together. And trailing right behind him, holding a crystal wine glass filled with expensive rose, was his younger sister, Bethany. Bethany was 29 years old, and she had never held a real job in her entire life. She called herself a lifestyle coach and an energy healer, which essentially meant she lived off other people while posting heavily filtered photos of expensive matcha lattes on social media. She had always treated me with a thinly veiled contempt, treating my nursing career like a tragic blue-collar hobby. When Julian and I first started dating, Bethany was living in a luxury apartment downtown funded entirely by their parents. When their parents finally cut her off due to their own declining finances, Julian seamlessly took over the role of her personal bank. I used to think he was just being a protective older brother, keeping his sister afloat while she found her calling. Now standing in the driveway, staring at the moving truck and the luxury SUV, I realized the horrifying absolute truth. I walked up the stone pathway, my faded navy blue nursing scrubs, feeling painfully inadequate, next to Bethany's pure silk loungewear. Julian smiled as I approached, the kind of bright, charismatic smile that never quite reached his cold, dead eyes. "Chloe, you are home early," he said, his voice perfectly smooth and casual. "I thought your hospital shift did not end until 7 tonight." I ignored his greeting. My heart was pounding so hard, I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. "Julian, what is going on here?" I asked, gesturing wildly toward the moving truck and the Range Rover. "And why did the bank call me an hour ago to verify a $250,000 wire transfer to a wellness brand?" Julian did not blink. His smile remained plastered on his handsome face. He casually slipped his hands into his tailored pockets, acting as if we were discussing the weather. "I told you we were doing a corporate restructuring," he said smoothly. "Bethany is launching her new holistic wellness brand next month. She needed seed capital and a temporary place to stay while her new custom house is being built. She is going to live in our guest house for a while." The air vanished from my lungs completely. I looked at Bethany. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine and offered me a condescending little wave, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. "You used the commercial loan to pay for her wellness brand." I choked out, the betrayal hitting me so hard, my knees actually felt weak. "Julian, you forced me to sign those loan papers this morning. You pinned me against a wall and told me it was for a commercial plaza downtown. You swore the bank required my credit score for a construction guarantee on a retail space." "It is a corporate restructuring," Chloe, Julian said, his tone shifting from casual to slightly annoyed. "It is complicated high-level business finance. Bethany had some massive outstanding credit card liabilities that were negatively affecting the family trust. I used the capital to pay off her debts and fund the initial inventory for her wellness brand. It is all safely under the same corporate umbrella. Do not stress your pretty little head over the complex accounting details. The money is exactly where it needs to be." I stared at him in absolute, unadulterated horror. $250,000. I repeated, my voice rising in pitch, despite my intense, lingering fear of him. "You took out $250,000 in debt against my personal name, and the bank representative told me the funds were being drawn directly against our primary mortgage. You leveraged the house, Julian. The house that is legally in my name because your business accounts were too aggressive for the underwriter. You leveraged our primary home to pay off your sister's credit card shopping sprees. Bethany let out a loud, dramatic sigh. She rolled her eyes toward the porch ceiling and leaned heavily against one of the white columns. God, Julian, she complained, her voice dripping with extreme entitlement. You told me she was going to be supportive of my journey. Why is she being so incredibly dramatic about a tiny business loan? It is not like she could ever afford to fund my brand on a pathetic nurse's salary anyway. I turned to look at her, my vision literally going red at the edges. A tiny business loan, I shot back, the blinding anger briefly overriding my deep-seated terror. That tiny loan is tied directly to my personal financial identity, Bethany. I work brutal 12-hour shifts cleaning up vomit and holding the hands of dying children just to pay the basic utility bills for this massive house because your brother claims all his liquid cash is tied up in equity. And now you are moving into my guest house and using my stolen credit to fund a fake lifestyle company and buy a luxury vehicle. Silence descended on the porch. It was heavy, suffocating, and profoundly dangerous. Bethany looked at me with a mixture of profound shock and deep disgust, as if a piece of household furniture had just spoken back to her. She took another slow, deliberate sip of her wine, acting completely unbothered by the fact that she was currently destroying my entire financial future. She did not care about the crippling debt. She did not care about my ruined credit score or my exhausting hours at the hospital. She only cared about her new Range Rover and her pristine white leather sofa. Then Julian moved. He did not run or rush. He stepped down off the wooden porch with a terrifying, predatory grace. The charming, wealthy brother vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, violent monster I lived in constant fear of. He closed the physical distance between us in 3 long, purposeful strides. I backed up instinctively, my heel catching hard on the rough edge of a stone paver. I stumbled backward, nearly falling onto the perfectly manicured lawn. Julian did not stop walking until he was standing mere inches from my face. His sheer physical size completely eclipsed the afternoon sun, casting a cold, dark shadow over my trembling body. He raised his right hand into the air. His fist was clenched so tightly, his knuckles were bone white. He held it suspended in the air, just above my eye level, a silent, terrifying promise of the brutal violence he was fully capable of unleashing. I flinched violently, squeezing my eyes shut and throwing both of my arms up over my face to protect my jaw from the incoming blow. I waited for the heavy impact. I waited for the blinding flash of white-hot pain that would send me crashing to the stone driveway. My ribs still ached terribly from where he had shoved me into the heavy doorframe the night before. My bicep throbbed painfully under the thick layer of theatrical concealer. I braced myself for the strike, my entire body shaking like a leaf in a winter hurricane, but the crushing punch did not come. Instead, cutting through the tense silence, I heard Bethany laugh. It was a soft, highly amused little sound. I slowly lowered my shaking arms and opened my terrified eyes. Julian was still standing directly over me. His heavy fist raised his handsome face, a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. And standing on the porch, just 10 feet away, Bethany was casually sipping her rose, completely unfazed by the fact that her older brother was about to brutally beat his wife in broad daylight. She looked away, checking her perfectly manicured fingernails, as if she were waiting in a slow line at a coffee shop. "Listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful little parasite," Julian whispered, his voice dropping into that deadly quiet register that always preceded extreme physical pain. "You're going to walk inside this house, right now. You're going to go into the kitchen and prepare a beautiful dinner for my sister. You are going to welcome her into our home with a bright smile on your face. And if you ever speak to her like that again, or question my financial decisions in public, I will put you in the intensive care unit for a very long time. Do you understand me?" I stared up at him, the terror freezing the blood solid in my veins. He was not just threatening my physical safety. He was showing me exactly what my life actually was. He was showing me that I had absolutely no allies, no avenue of escape, and no human worth beyond what I could financially provide for him and his parasitic family. I was not a respected wife or a loved partner. I was an imprisoned hostage with a pristine credit score, "Do you understand me?" he repeated, stepping even closer until I could feel the angry heat radiating off his chest. "Yes," I whispered, my voice cracking pathetically in my dry throat. "I understand." He stared at me for one more long, agonizing second, letting the sheer, terrifying weight of his absolute control press down heavily on my chest. Then, he slowly, deliberately lowered his fist. He stepped back, smoothing the front of his expensive designer shirt. The terrifying, violent monster vanished in an instant, seamlessly replaced by the wealthy, charming real estate developer. "Good," he said brightly, turning his back on me and walking casually toward the porch. "Bethany let us go look at the guest house interior. The movers should have the main living room completely set up by now. I want to make absolutely sure the feng shui is right for your delicate creative process." Bethany smiled widely, linking her slender arm through his. "Thank you, Julian. You are literally the absolute best brother in the entire world. I cannot wait to show you the vision board for my branding launch tomorrow." They walked away, leaving me standing completely alone in the cold driveway. I watched them disappear around the side of the massive main house, chatting and laughing as if they had not just destroyed my entire life. The moving men continued carrying heavy cardboard boxes, completely oblivious to the devastating psychological slaughter that had just taken place right in front of them. I stood there for a long time, the crisp autumn air chilling the cold sweat on the back of my neck. My exhausted mind was spinning, trying desperately to process the absolute magnitude of the betrayal. For 2 agonizing years, I had believed Julian's complex lies. I had genuinely believed his development business was struggling. I had truly believed his assets were tied up in complex corporate structures that I could not understand. I had worked grueling 60-hour weeks at the pediatric oncology ward, taking extra difficult shifts on major holidays and long weekends just to keep our heads above water. I had relentlessly clipped grocery coupons. I had driven a failing 10-year-old car with a broken heater during freezing winters. I had sacrificed every single ounce of my youth, my energy, and my sanity to unconditionally support the man I loved. But he had never been struggling. He had been systematically harvesting me. I was nothing but a convenient host organism for a relentless parasite. And it was not just Julian feeding on my life. It was his entire entitled family. I realized with a sickening, devastating wave of absolute clarity that I was the financial blood supply for all of them. My grueling nursing shifts, my pristine credit score, my stolen life savings. It was all being ruthlessly used to fund Bethany's luxury lifestyle, her massive credit card debt, her fake wellness brand, her new luxury vehicle. They were bleeding me completely dry, and when there was absolutely nothing left, they would simply throw my empty husk out into the street. A profound, crushing sense of absolute defeat washed over my trembling body. The fight completely drained out of my muscles, leaving nothing but a hollow, echoing void inside my chest. I could not possibly win. Julian held every single card. He completely controlled the money. He controlled the deed to the house. He controlled my physical safety. If I tried to leave him, he would ruin me financially, and then he would likely kill me. He had explicitly promised me as much on more than one terrifying occasion. I dragged my heavy, exhausted feet up the stone pathway and walked slowly into the main house. The grand foyer was quiet and freezing cold. The pristine gray stone floors and towering floor-to-ceiling glass mocked my silent misery. I walked down the long, echoing hallway and pushed heavily through the swinging wooden door into the massive, pristine chef's kitchen. I dropped my cheap-worn purse onto the gleaming granite island and leaned heavily against the cold counter, burying my face deep in my shaking hands. I did not cry. The pain was far too deep and too absolute for tears. I felt entirely, completely broken beyond repair. I was a 31-year-old pediatric oncology nurse who spent her long days fiercely fighting for the fragile lives of sick children, and I did not have an ounce of strength left to fight for my own survival. I was permanently trapped in a living nightmare with no hope of ever waking up. I walked slowly over to the massive stainless steel refrigerator, pulling open the heavy door to see what meager supplies I could use to prepare Bethany's demanded dinner. My hands were shaking so violently, I dropped a hard plastic container of fresh vegetables onto the floor. It hit the hardwood tiles with a loud, sharp crack, spilling bright cherry tomatoes across the immaculate room. I dropped heavily to my bruised knees, crawling pathetically across the cold floor, gathering the small red tomatoes with trembling, terrified fingers. I felt entirely pathetic. I felt completely, utterly worthless. I gathered the spilled food and threw it forcefully into the metal trash can. I leaned heavily against the steel sink, staring blankly out the large window at the rapidly darkening sky. The autumn sun was setting, casting long, dark, sinister shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. My life was officially over. I was going to spend the rest of my miserable days paying off a massive fraudulent commercial loan, living in constant, absolute terror of my husband's heavy fists, and serving as the unpaid live-in maid for his deeply entitled sister. This was my unchangeable reality. This was my agonizing forever. I closed my tired eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath, completely resigning myself to the encroaching darkness. And then, echoing loudly through the silent, empty house, I heard a sudden sound. It was incredibly sharp and entirely distinct. 3 heavy, rhythmic, authoritative knocks at the solid oak front door. My eyes snapped wide open. I froze instantly to my trembling hand hovering over the cold kitchen faucet. We were definitely not expecting any guests tonight. The wealthy caterers from the dinner party were long gone. The real estate investors had already been thoroughly entertained. Bethany's hired movers were working exclusively at the guest house around the back of the massive property. Julian was deeply protective of his carefully constructed privacy and absolutely hated unannounced visitors. He specifically lived in a highly secure gated community to prevent any random salespeople or curious neighbors from casually dropping by. The heavy knocking came again. 3 sharp, deliberate raps echoing loudly down the long marble hallway. It was not the hesitant, soft knock of a lost delivery driver. It was the firm, commanding, authoritative knock of someone who fully and completely expected the heavy door to be opened immediately. My heart began to race wildly in my chest. An entirely new kind of panic settled deeply into my lungs. If it was an official representative from the bank coming to personally verify the fraudulent wire transfer, Julian would be absolutely furious. If it was an angry neighbor complaining about the large moving truck blocking the street, Julian would take his extreme embarrassment out directly on my physical body. I quickly wiped my wet hands on my scrubs, frantically checking my pale reflection in the dark glass of the oven door to make absolutely sure the thick, theatrical concealer was still completely hiding the dark, ugly bruise on my jawline. I hurried quickly out of the kitchen and walked down the long, echoing hallway toward the grand foyer. The massive house was unnervingly completely silent. I could hear the faint, distant sound of Julian and Bethany laughing loudly from the guest house across the property, completely unaware of the unexpected visitor currently standing at the main entrance. I reached the massive oak door and placed my trembling, sweating hand on the cold, heavy brass handle. I took a deep, steadying breath, pasting my perfect, flawless, entirely dead smile back onto my face, desperately preparing to play the required role of the happy, wealthy, supportive wife. I firmly turned the heavy brass deadbolt and slowly, cautiously pulled the massive oak door open. The heavy oak door echoed with 3 sharp knocks. I stood in the grand foyer of my own home, feeling like a trespasser caught in the act. My breath hitched in my throat. I smoothed down the fabric of my scrubs and desperately prayed that my heavy, theatrical concealer was completely intact. I reached out and turned the cold brass handle, pulling the massive door inward. Standing on our pristine front porch was my late father's brother. Uncle Harrison was 62 years old, and he had spent 35 of those years working as a state police detective. He was a tall man with broad shoulders. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and he had these piercing gray eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He wore a simple plaid button-down shirt and a worn leather jacket that smelled faintly of peppermint and old books. He was the only real family I had left in the world, but I had not seen him in almost a year. Julian always found an excuse to keep us away from family gatherings, claiming he was too busy with his real estate developments, or that we needed a quiet weekend alone. "Chloe," he said, his voice warm and familiar. His eyes crinkled at the corners as he offered me a genuine smile. "I was passing through town on my way back from a fishing trip up north. I know I should have called first, but I saw the cars in the driveway and figured I would take a chance. I hope I am not interrupting anything important." I stared at him, my mind completely blank with panic. My heart was hammering against my bruised ribs. If Julian came out and saw a retired police detective standing on our front porch just minutes after violently threatening me, he would be absolutely furious. I tried to speak, but my throat was bone dry. "Uncle Harrison," I finally managed, forcing my facial muscles into a bright, welcoming smile. "It is so good to see you. You are not interrupting at all. Please come inside." He stepped into the massive glass and stone foyer, taking off his jacket. He looked around the pristine, empty space. His detective eyes were already working, automatically scanning the environment. I saw him take in the sheer size of the house, the expensive artwork on the walls, and the absolute lack of any personal touches. "Who is at the door, Chloe?" The voice floated down the hallway, smooth and completely relaxed. Julian rounded the corner a moment later, with Bethany right behind him. The transformation was instantaneous and utterly terrifying. Less than 10 minutes ago, Julian had been standing over me in the driveway, with his fist raised, preparing to brutally assault me. Now his handsome face broke into a wide, delighted grin. He walked forward with his hand outstretched, the perfect picture of a wealthy, charming host. Harrison Julian boomed, his voice echoing cheerfully in the large foyer. "What a fantastic surprise. We were just getting Bethany settled into the guest house. It is so great to see you. Please tell me you are staying for dinner." I watched my husband shake my uncle's hand, and I felt a wave of profound nausea wash over me. Julian was a master of psychological manipulation. He could switch between a violent predator and a charismatic gentleman in the blink of an eye. He clapped Harrison on the shoulder, offering him a warm, inviting laugh. "I appreciate the offer," Julian Harrison said, returning the handshake firmly, "but I cannot stay long. I just wanted to drop in and see my favorite niece. I have a hotel booked downtown for the night before I hit the road again tomorrow morning." "Nonsense," Julian insisted, wrapping his arm tightly around my waist. His fingers dug painfully into my side, a silent warning for me to play along perfectly. "You are family, Harrison. You are always welcome here. Chloe, why do not you go to the kitchen and put a kettle on for tea? Harrison always likes that chamomile blend you buy." "Of course," I whispered. My voice sounded hollow and distant to my own ears. "I will be right back." I pulled away from Julian's crushing grip and walked quickly toward the kitchen. My legs felt like lead. The kitchen was massive and cold, with its stainless steel appliances and white granite countertops. I grabbed the electric kettle and filled it with water, my hands shaking so violently that water sloshed over the sides onto the floor. I grabbed a kitchen towel and wiped it up frantically, terrified that Julian would come in and punish me for making a mess. I could hear them talking in the living room. Julian was casually explaining his sister's fake wellness brand, spinning a web of corporate lies with absolute ease. He sounded so reasonable, so supportive, so incredibly normal. I opened the pantry and reached for the tea boxes. My right arm throbbed with a sickening heat. The massive bruise on my inner bicep from the dinner party the night before ached with every single movement. I had covered it with thick orange color corrector and flesh-toned concealer, but the skin was heavily swollen and extremely tender. The kettle clicked off, signaling the water was boiling. I arranged 3 ceramic mugs on a wooden serving tray. I dropped a tea bag into each one and poured the steaming water. My breathing was shallow and rapid. I needed to get back out there. If I stayed in the kitchen too long, Julian would get suspicious. He hated when I was out of his direct line of sight during social interactions. I picked up the heavy wooden tray and walked slowly back into the living room. Julian was sitting in a custom leather armchair, his legs crossed casually at the ankle. Bethany was sitting on the sofa, checking her phone, completely uninterested in the conversation. Uncle Harrison was sitting on the edge of the matching leather love seat, leaning forward slightly. "Here's the tea," I said, keeping my voice artificially bright and steady. I walked over to the glass coffee table to set the tray down. I needed to lean forward and extend my arms fully to reach the center of the wide table. I was wearing a loose-fitting knit cardigan over my scrubs, trying to hide the swelling on my arm. As I leaned over the table, the loose sleeve of my cardigan caught on the sharp metal corner of a decorative brass box Julian kept on the table. I pulled my arm back instinctively to free the fabric. The sudden movement yanked the soft sleeve completely up my arm, pushing the fabric all the way past my elbow. I froze. The wooden tray rattled violently as I hastily dropped it onto the glass surface. The heavy layer of makeup I had applied that morning had rubbed off against the inside of my sleeve during my long shift at the hospital. Exposed to the bright overhead lighting of the living room was the undeniable, horrifying truth. A massive dark purple and sickly yellow bruise covered the entire inside of my right bicep. It was not a random, shapeless mark from bumping into a door frame. It was a perfect, unmistakable cluster of dark oval fingerprints, where a large, powerful hand had brutally gripped and crushed my muscle against the bone. The silence in the living room was sudden and absolute. It was a thick, suffocating silence that pulled all the oxygen from the air. I snapped my arm back to my chest, frantically pulling the sleeve down, but it was far too late. The damage was completely done. I looked up, terrified. Uncle Harrison was sitting completely still. His gray eyes, trained by 35 years of investigating violent crimes, were locked directly onto my right arm. He did not blink. He did not look away. I watched his mind process the exact shape, the specific color, and the undeniable origin of that brutal injury. He knew exactly what it was. He had seen injuries just like it on hundreds of terrified women during his long career in law enforcement. The air in the room grew dangerously cold. Julian realized exactly what had just happened. Julian slowly, deliberately uncrossed his legs. He did not look at my arm. He looked directly at Harrison. I saw the muscles in Julian's jaw clench tightly. The charming, wealthy host persona cracked for a fraction of a second, revealing the cold, calculating monster underneath. Julian slowly stood up from his leather chair. He did not say a single word, but he took one deliberate step closer to me, placing his large body strategically between me and the front door. It was a silent, terrifying promise. He was establishing absolute physical dominance over the room. I could not breathe. My lungs simply refused to expand. I waited for the explosion. I waited for Harrison to jump up and start shouting. I waited for the retired detective to demand answers, to grab Julian by his expensive collar and drag him out into the street. I was absolutely terrified because I knew exactly what Julian would do if cornered. Julian had repeatedly told me that if I ever called the cops or told anyone about the abuse, he would ensure I had a fatal accident before the police ever arrived. He promised me that his expensive lawyers would bury the truth and he would walk away completely free. The silence stretched on for 5 agonizing seconds. 10 seconds. Then Uncle Harrison did something I completely failed to understand. He leaned back into the sofa and let out a soft, relaxed sigh. He reached forward and picked up his steaming mug of tea. He brought it to his lips and took a slow, careful sip. He did not yell. He did not confront my abusive husband. He did not even ask if I was okay. "This chamomile is fantastic, Chloe," he said, his voice perfectly even and entirely conversational. "Thank you for making it." I stared at him, completely bewildered. "You are welcome, Uncle Harrison," I whispered, my voice trembling uncontrollably. Julian stayed standing, his posture rigid, his dark eyes darting between me and Harrison. He was trying to calculate if the old detective had actually seen the violent evidence or if he was just blissfully ignorant. Harrison gave him absolutely nothing to work with. The retired cop was a stone wall. So Julian Harrison continued setting his mug back on the tray with a soft clink. "How is the commercial real estate market treating you these days? I heard interest rates are making new developments incredibly tricky to finance." Julian slowly forced his facial muscles to relax. He slipped his hands into his pockets, adopting his casual business posture once again. "It is challenging," he replied, his voice smooth and controlled. "But we manage. It is all about securing the right capital and maintaining pristine credit profiles." They talked about the economy for another 10 minutes. I stood perfectly still near the sofa, too terrified to move, too terrified to speak. My mind was racing frantically. Had Harrison missed it? Was his eyesight failing in his old age? Did he see the brutal fingerprints and simply decide he did not care enough to get involved? The betrayal stung worse than the physical pain in my arm. I was drowning in plain sight, and the only person who could throw me a lifeline had simply looked away and taken another sip of tea. Finally, Harrison checked his watch and stood up. "Well, I should let you folks get back to your evening. I have a long drive back home tomorrow morning, and I want to beat the heavy traffic on the interstate." Julian smiled that bright, empty, charismatic smile. "It was great seeing you, Harrison. Do not be a stranger. Next time you are in town, you have to stay with us. We have plenty of room." "I will keep that in mind," Harrison said. He put on his worn leather jacket and walked toward the grand foyer. Julian followed him closely, making absolutely sure he escorted him all the way to the door. I trailed behind them, my arms wrapped tightly around my stomach. Harrison opened the heavy oak door and stepped out onto the cold porch. He turned back to face us. He shook Julian's hand one last time. Then his piercing gray eyes shifted to me. He looked deep into my eyes for a long, silent moment. It was a heavy, undecipherable look. There was no pity in his expression. There was no anger. There was only a quiet, intense calculation that sent a shiver straight down my spine. "Take care of yourself, Chloe," he said softly. "I will see you around." He turned and walked down the stone pathway toward his car. Julian stood in the open doorway, watching him go. Julian waited until Harrison's car pulled out of our long driveway and disappeared down the dark, private road. Then slowly, deliberately, Julian reached up and turned the heavy brass deadbolt. The loud metallic click echoed through the empty foyer, sounding exactly like a prison cell locking shut. Julian turned to face me. The charming host was completely gone. His eyes were dark flat and devoid of anything remotely human. He stepped toward me, backing me up against the cold glass wall of the foyer. "Did you do that on purpose?" he whispered, his voice dropping into that deadly quiet register that always preceded extreme physical pain. "No," I sobbed, tears immediately spilling over my cheeks. "Julian!" "I swear it was an accident. The sleeve just caught on the box." "Please, I am so sorry." He grabbed my jaw with his large hand, his fingers digging painfully into my cheeks, forcing me to look up into his terrifying eyes. "If that old man calls the cops, Chloe." He hissed, his breath hot against my face. "If a single police cruiser pulls into my driveway tonight, you will not live long enough to see the sunrise. Do you understand me? I will break your neck before they even reach the front porch, and I will tell them you fell down the stairs in a hysterical panic." I understand. I choked out the fear completely paralyzing my body. "I understand. Please do not hurt me." He released my jaw roughly, letting my head snap back against the glass. He stared at me with absolute disgust for one more long, agonizing second. "Clean up the tea," he commanded, walking away toward his home office. "And stay out of my sight for the rest of the night." I spent that entire night lying completely awake in our dark bedroom. Julian was asleep next to me, his chest rising and falling in a steady, rhythmic pattern. I was absolutely petrified. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the large windows, listening to the house settle in the cold night air. Every time a car drove past our private road on the distant highway, my heart stopped beating. I was terrified that Uncle Harrison had driven straight to the local police precinct. I was terrified that a tactical team was going to kick down our front door. Julian was a light sleeper. If he heard the sirens approaching, he would carry out his promise without hesitation. He would kill me to protect his perfect reputation. I prayed for the sunrise. I prayed that Harrison had simply ignored the bruise. I prayed that he would just drive back to his own life and leave me in my permanent nightmare. The sun finally rose, casting long gray shadows across the bedroom floor. No police came. No sirens wailed in the distance. The heavy silence of the house remained completely unbroken. I crept out of bed, exhausted and trembling. I went through the motions of my morning routine, applying a fresh, thick layer of heavy-duty theatrical concealer over my arm and my ribs. I avoided looking at myself in the mirror. I felt like a hollow, empty shell. Julian ignored me completely when I left for work. He was sitting at the kitchen island, drinking coffee and reading financial reports, acting as if nothing traumatic had happened the night before. I practically ran to my old sedan, locking the doors instantly, and driving away from the massive custom-built prison. The drive to the hospital was a blur. The morning fog was thick, rolling heavily over the interstate, dampening the sounds of the early commuter traffic. I just wanted to get to the oncology ward. I wanted to put on my compassionate nurse smile and hide inside the clinical routine of charting medications and checking vitals. I pulled into the sprawling hospital staff parking lot around 7 in the morning. The air was cold and damp. I parked my car in my usual spot near the back concrete wall and turned off the engine. I grabbed my worn tote bag from the passenger seat, taking a deep, shuddering breath before opening my door. I stepped out onto the cold, wet pavement, and then I stopped completely frozen in place. Leaning casually against the concrete pillar, just 2 parking spaces away, was Uncle Harrison. He was wearing the same worn leather jacket from the night before, holding 2 large paper cups of steaming coffee. The heavy morning fog swirled around his boots. He did not look surprised to see me. He looked like he had been waiting there for a very long time. My heart instantly jumped into my throat. The sheer terror from the night before came rushing back, hitting me like a physical blow. If Julian found out I was secretly meeting with a retired police detective behind his back, he would murder me. I looked around the parking lot, frantically checking the windows of the parked cars, terrified that Julian had followed me, terrified that someone was watching. "Uncle Harrison." "What are you doing here?" I whispered, my voice cracking with panic. "You cannot be here. You have to leave. If Julian finds out you are talking to me, he will kill me. He promised me he would kill me." Harrison did not move toward me. He did not make any sudden gestures that might startle me. He just stood there, holding the coffee, looking at me with those piercing gray eyes. The conversational, polite uncle from the living room was entirely gone. Standing in the foggy parking lot was the hardened veteran detective who had spent 3 decades dismantling violent criminals. "I know he will, Chloe." Harrison said, his voice steady, calm, and completely serious. "That is exactly why I did not say a single word inside that house last night, and that is exactly why I did not call the local police precinct." I stared at him, my hands trembling, gripping the strap of my tote bag so tightly my knuckles ached. "You know," I asked, my voice barely a breathless whisper. Harrison took one slow, careful step forward, offering me one of the warm coffee cups. "I know exactly what kind of monster you are living with," he said softly. "I saw the bruises on your arm. I saw the way he cornered you in the foyer. I saw the fear in your eyes when the deadbolt clicked shut." Tears instantly flooded my vision, blurring the gray concrete and the thick morning fog. I tried to wipe them away, but they kept falling hot and fast down my freezing cheeks. "I am so trapped," I sobbed, the absolute truth finally breaking through the heavy silence I had maintained for 2 agonizing years. "Uncle Harrison, I am completely trapped. He forced me to sign a massive fraudulent commercial loan yesterday. He is stealing my money. He controls everything. I cannot escape him." Harrison stepped closer, reaching out and placing a strong, warm hand on my trembling shoulder. His grip was firm, grounding me in the terrifying reality of the moment. "Listen to me very carefully, Chloe," he said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute professional authority. "I have spent my entire adult life pulling women out of situations exactly like this one. I know how dangerous these men are. If we rush this, if we confront him without a rock-solid exit plan, he will escalate and you will not survive the fallout." I nodded frantically, the tears still streaming down my face. "What do we do?" I asked desperately. "We are going to dismantle his entire life," Harrison said, his gray eyes turning cold and hard as steel. "We are going to build an undeniable case against him. We are going to lock him in a federal prison for a very long time. But to do that, I need you to be braver than you have ever been in your entire life. I need you to go back into that house and play the perfect, obedient wife." I stared at him, the sheer terror warring, with the first tiny spark of actual hope I had felt in 2 years. I did not know how I was going to survive another night in that house. But looking into my uncle's steady, experienced eyes, I realized something profound. I was finally no longer fighting this monster completely alone. I stood frozen in the damp hospital parking lot, clutching my tote bag like a useless shield. Thick gray fog swirled around the parked cars. Uncle Harrison leaned against the concrete pillar, holding 2 steaming coffee cups. His piercing gray eyes locked onto mine with the intense focus of a seasoned detective. I felt the familiar suffocating wave of pure terror wash over my tired body. If Julian found out I was talking to a retired police officer in the parking lot of my workplace, he would absolutely follow through on his horrific promise. He would kill me and make it look like a tragic accident. I took a terrified step backward, my nursing shoes scraping the wet pavement. My legs simply refused to run back into the safety of the hospital. Harrison pushed off the pillar, projecting absolute calm. He took 3 measured steps, stopping a safe distance away. He extended his right hand, offering me one of the white paper cups. "I know, you are terrified, Chloe," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying a profound weight of professional experience. "I know you think he is watching you right now and that taking this coffee signs your death warrant." He kept his arm extended, devoid of pity. My heart hammered violently against my bruised ribs. "You have to leave," I whispered, my voice cracking pathetically in the freezing morning air. "Uncle Harrison, please, you do not understand what he is capable of. He will hurt you, and then he will destroy me completely. Please, just drive away before someone sees us standing here." Harrison did not flinch. He simply stood his ground, anchored like an old oak tree in a winter hurricane. "I understand exactly what he is capable of, Chloe," he said softly. "I spent 35 years working domestic homicide and financial fraud for the state police. I've sat across the interrogation table from dozens of extremely violent men. Men who wear expensive tailored suits and charm entire rooms of wealthy investors while systematically crushing the life out of the terrified women trapped inside their homes. I know the exact shape of that brutal bruise on your arm. I know exactly how much carefully applied pressure it takes to leave a dark mark like that. And I know that if I had yelled at him in your glass foyer last night, he would have taken all of his extreme humiliation out on you the absolute minute I drove away." The profound truth in his words hit me with the physical force of a heavy blow. Standing here in the freezing fog, looking into the steady, unwavering eyes of my late father's brother, I realized that my thick theatrical concealer had not fooled him for a single second. He saw everything. He saw the financial abuse, the physical violence, the psychological torture. And most importantly, he did not blame me for staying. He knew that leaving without a plan was the most dangerous thing a battered woman could ever possibly do. Tears spilled hot and fast over my freezing cheeks, ruining my careful foundation. I finally reached out with a trembling hand and took the warm coffee cup from his strong, unyielding grasp. The heat radiating through the cheap cardboard grounded me slightly, pulling me out of my spiraling panic. Harrison took a slow, careful sip from his own cup, watching me quietly. "We cannot just confront him," he explained, his voice dropping into a register of absolute professional authority. "Men like Julian thrive on absolute control. If he senses that he is losing his absolute grip on you, he will escalate the violence to a lethal level. If we are going to dismantle his life and save yours, we have to do it with extreme surgical precision. We need an airtight legal strategy and a rock-solid exit plan that strips him of his power before he even realizes he is under attack. We have to destroy him financially and legally so that when the police finally put him in steel handcuffs, he has absolutely no resource left to fight back against us in court." I stared at my uncle, the sheer magnitude of what he was proposing echoing loudly in my exhausted mind. But he has everything, I sobbed, the absolute hopelessness of my situation crashing down heavily on my tired shoulders. He forced me to sign a massive commercial loan yesterday, wiring $250,000 to his sister's fake wellness brand. His expensive corporate lawyers will bury me completely. I have absolutely nothing left to fight with. Harrison smiled, a very small, very cold smile that did not reach his piercing gray eyes. "That is where you are completely, absolutely wrong, Chloe," he said, his tone shifting to a hardened state detective. "You have access. You live inside his carefully constructed fortress. You are the invisible ghost he ignores because he thinks he has broken your spirit entirely. We are going to use his extreme arrogance directly against him. We are going to turn you into the exact weapon that will dismantle his entire fake empire. But to do that, I need you to be braver than you have ever been in your entire life. I need you to go back into that custom-built glass prison and play the perfect, obedient, submissive wife. You have to smile at him constantly. You have to act completely, utterly defeated. Harrison reached deep into the inside pocket of his worn leather jacket. He pulled out a small black object and pressed it firmly into the palm of my free, trembling hand. It was a cheap, prepaid burner phone. "Keep this turned off and hidden somewhere. He will never look," he instructed, keeping his calm voice exceptionally low. Taped securely to the back of the small phone was something else. A tiny silver flash drive no bigger than my thumbnail. "I have friends who still work in forensic accounting for the Federal Bureau of Investigation," Harrison continued. "We need undeniable digital proof of his massive wire fraud, his hidden offshore accounts, and his complex money laundering networks. Julian keeps all of his master ledgers on the encrypted desktop computer in his locked home office. I need you to wait until he is completely distracted tonight. I need you to sneak into that dark office, plug this drive into the back of his computer, and run the hidden extraction program I installed on it. It will automatically copy every single financial document and private email on his hard drive. It will take exactly 4 minutes to complete the full transfer." My hand shook so violently, I nearly dropped the tiny silver drive onto the wet concrete. "Uncle Harrison, if he catches me in his private office, he will not just beat me," I whispered, the absolute terror completely seizing my vocal cords. "He keeps that heavy mahogany door locked at all times. He holds the only physical key on his personal keyring. If he finds me sitting at his desk, downloading his private financial files, he will snap my neck with his bare hands." Harrison reached out and gripped my shoulder firmly, his strong fingers grounding me in stark reality. "I know the extreme risk, Chloe," he said gravely. "But if the banks discover the fraudulent commercial loans before we bring this digital evidence to the federal authorities, you will definitely go down as his willing co-conspirator. We have exactly 4 days before his massive investor launch gala this weekend. We have 4 days to gather the digital evidence, secure an emergency asset freeze, and get a local judge to sign a no-knock arrest warrant. You can do this. You are a highly trained pediatric oncology nurse. You literally deal with tragic life and death every single day. You are the absolute strongest woman I have ever known." I looked down at the tiny silver flash drive resting in my trembling palm. It was the absolute key to my permanent freedom, and it was also a potential death sentence. I closed my fingers tightly around the cold metal, shoving it deep into the pocket of my navy blue scrubs, along with the prepaid burner phone. I took a deep, shuddering breath, filling my lungs with the damp, foggy air. "I will do it, I said, my voice finally losing its pathetic tremble. "I will get you the files tonight." Harrison gave me one curt, professional nod, turning on his heel and disappearing quickly into the thick gray fog, leaving me completely alone in the parking lot to face the most terrifying 12 hours of my entire life. The rest of my hospital shift passed in a surreal, agonizing blur. When my shift finally ended at 7 in the evening, I drove back to the sprawling modern mansion, feeling like a soldier marching directly behind enemy lines. I pulled into the pristine driveway, parking my old sedan far away from Bethany's gleaming white luxury sport utility vehicle. I walked through the heavy oak front door, plastering that bright, flawless, entirely dead smile onto my face. Julian and Bethany were sitting outside on the massive stone patio, enjoying the crisp evening air under the glow of the outdoor heating lamps. They were drinking expensive champagne, laughing loudly at some terrible inside joke. Julian barely glanced at me through the floor-to-ceiling glass doors when I walked into the pristine kitchen. He simply raised his empty crystal glass, pointing a demanding finger at the expensive bottle of champagne resting in the silver ice bucket on the granite island. It was a silent, arrogant command for me to bring the bottle outside and serve them like a hired maid. I nodded submissively, grabbing the cold green bottle and walking out onto the stone patio, pouring the bubbling liquid into their empty glasses completely obediently. Julian did not even say thank you. He just continued talking to his sister, completely ignoring my pathetic existence. Through the glass doors, I watched Julian set his heavy set of keys onto the outdoor patio table. The single brass key to his locked home office gleamed under the warm yellow light. My heart instantly jumped directly into my throat. Bethany stood up, walking toward the edge of the massive stone patio to admire the expensive landscaping. Julian turned his head to eagerly follow her. His back was completely turned away from the glass table. I moved with desperate, silent speed, sliding the glass door open just an inch. I grabbed the heavy keyring, my fingers wrapping tightly around the cold metal. I turned and ran silently down the long, dark hallway, reaching the heavy mahogany door of his private home office. My hands were shaking so violently, I could barely fit the brass key into the lock. I pushed the door open, slipping inside the dark office. I crawled under the heavy wooden desk and plugged the tiny silver flash drive directly into the back of his computer. The large monitor flared to life, displaying a small white progress bar. 10%, 20%. The transfer was agonizingly slow. I crouched beneath the desk, watching the tiny white bar crawl across the glowing screen, my heart pounding so hard I felt physically sick. 70%, 80%. And then, echoing loudly down the pristine hardwood hallway outside the office, I heard a sound that made the blood freeze entirely solid in my veins. The heavy, distinct, rhythmic sound of Julian's expensive leather dress shoes walking purposefully toward the closed office door. 90%. The brass door handle began to turn slowly, pressing down with a terrifying metallic squeak. The transfer was not finished, and I was completely trapped. 95%. The heavy mahogany door pushed inward, opening with a slow, agonizing creak. The progress bar on the glowing computer screen inched forward. 98%. Julian's expensive leather dress shoes stepped onto the thick Persian rug of the home office. I was crouched beneath the massive wooden desk, my heart hammering against my bruised ribs so violently I thought it might crack my chest wide open. 100%. A tiny green check mark flashed on the screen. The transfer was complete. I yanked the small silver flash drive from the back of the computer tower, clutching it so tightly the metal edges cut into my palm. I shoved the tiny drive deep into the pocket of my navy blue scrubs, just as Julian rounded the corner of the desk. He froze his dark eyes, locking onto my crouching form. The temperature in the room instantly plummeted. He did not say a word at first. He simply stared down at me, his handsome face twisting into a mask of cold, calculating suspicion. "What are you doing in here, Chloe?" His voice was a deadly, quiet hiss. "You know this office is strictly off-limits." I forced my trembling body to react. I dropped to my knees on the rug, grabbing a discarded, crumpled piece of paper from the floor and a small dust cloth I had shoved into my pocket earlier for this exact scenario. I kept my head bowed, adopting the pathetic, submissive posture I knew he demanded. "I am so sorry, Julian," I stammered, making sure my voice cracked with genuine terror. "I was just trying to be helpful." "You were so angry about the house being messy before the dinner party. I wanted to make sure your office was perfectly clean for your investor meetings this week." I dropped my cleaning cloth under the desk, and I was just picking it up. "Please do not be mad at me." He stared down at my trembling shoulders. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating. I held my breath, waiting for the heavy impact of his fist, waiting for him to drag me up by my hair and demand to see what was in my pockets. My entire life hinged on this single agonizing moment. If he asked me to empty my scrub pockets, it would be entirely over. The tiny silver flash drive would be my absolute death sentence. Julian slowly reached down. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the brutal strike. Instead, his large hand gripped my chin, his fingers digging painfully into my jawline as he forced my face upward to meet his cold, empty gaze. He studied my terrified expression, searching for any sign of deception. He saw the heavy theatrical concealer poorly hiding the dark bruise on my jaw. He saw the genuine, unadulterated fear pooling in my eyes. The fear was real, but it was not just fear of his violence anymore. It was the fear of losing my only chance at permanent freedom. "You are incredibly pathetic, Chloe," he whispered, a cruel smirk slowly forming on his lips. He released my jaw, wiping his hand on his expensive trousers, as if touching me had physically contaminated him. Sneaking around like a frightened maid, trying to earn my approval. It is honestly embarrassing to watch. I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on his expensive leather shoes. I am sorry, I whispered again. I will leave right now. Get out, he commanded, stepping aside just enough to let me pass. And if I ever catch you in this room again, I will give you a reason to be genuinely terrified. Do you understand me? Yes, Julian, I replied, my voice perfectly meek. I scrambled to my feet, keeping my head down as I rushed out of the mahogany doors and back down the pristine, echoing hallway. I did not stop walking until I reached the safety of the massive chef's kitchen. I leaned heavily against the cold granite island, gasping for air, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. I reached into my pocket and touched the cold metal of the tiny flash drive. I had done it. I had actually done it. The first crucial step of Uncle Harrison's plan was complete, but the true nightmare was only just beginning. The next morning, the dense coastal fog rolled heavily across the hospital parking lot, wrapping the concrete pillars in a thick gray blanket. I parked my old sedan in the same spot near the back wall, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I waited exactly 5 minutes, scanning the misty lot for any sign of Julian's sleek black sports car. When I was absolutely certain I was not being followed, I stepped out into the freezing morning air. Uncle Harrison was waiting for me inside a small nondescript diner 2 blocks away from the hospital. I walked briskly through the damp streets, the tiny silver flash drive burning a heavy hole in my scrub pocket. The diner smelled intensely of cheap bleach and old coffee. I slid into the cracked red vinyl booth across from the retired state police detective. He was drinking black coffee, his sharp gray eyes scanning my face the moment I sat down. He did not ask if I was okay. He knew I was not okay. Did you get it? Harrison asked. His voice low and strictly professional. I reached into my pocket, my fingers trembling slightly, as I pulled out the small metallic drive. I placed it gently on the scratched Formica table, sliding it across to him. He covered it instantly with his large weathered hand, making it completely vanish from sight. He almost caught me. I whispered, the residual terror making my chest painfully tight. He walked into the office right as the download finished. I had to pretend I was cleaning. If he had checked my pockets, he would have killed me, Uncle Harrison. He would have killed me right there on the rug. Harrison's jaw clenched tightly. But he did not check your pockets, Chloe. You stayed calm. You played the part perfectly, and you survived. Now it is my turn to do the heavy lifting. I have a trusted contact at the Bureau who owes me a very large favor, an expert forensic accountant who can crack whatever encryption Julian is using on these files. Go to your hospital shift. Be a nurse. Act completely normal. I will contact you on the burner phone the absolute second we have a clear picture of what we are dealing with. I nodded, standing up on shaky legs. Please hurry, I begged him softly. I cannot survive in that house much longer. Harrison offered me a single grim nod. We are going to tear his entire world apart, Chloe. Just hold on a little longer. I spent the next 24 hours living in a state of constant, suffocating anxiety. Every time my hospital pager beeped, I jumped. Every time I walked through the massive glass doors of my custom-built prison, I expected Julian to be waiting for me with the police. I played the obedient, terrified wife with flawless precision. I cooked his dinner, I pressed his expensive suits. I kept my eyes averted, and I endured his casual, cruel insults without a single word of protest. I was a ghost haunting my own miserable life, waiting desperately for a sign from the other side. The signal finally came the following evening. I was sitting in my car after a grueling 12-hour shift, the engine idling in the hospital parking garage. The cheap burner phone hidden deep inside the center console vibrated violently. I snatched it up and my heart racing. Meet me at the secure location, Harrison's voice instructed, offering no greeting and no explanation. The line went dead instantly. The secure location was an empty, unfinished commercial office space on the edge of the city, a property owned by one of Harrison's old law enforcement buddies. I drove there in a complete daze, my mind spinning with terrifying possibilities. When I walked through the heavy steel doors, the space was cold, smelling of fresh drywall and concrete dust. Harrison was standing near a makeshift folding table, illuminated by a single harsh construction lamp. Spread across the table were dozens of printed financial documents, bank statements, and legal contracts. He did not look triumphant. He looked profoundly, deeply disturbed. "Sit down," Chloe Harrison commanded gently, pulling up a cheap folding chair for me. I sat down, my eyes immediately drawn to the chaotic sea of paperwork. "What did you find?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the echoing empty room. Harrison leaned heavily against the table, running a tired hand over his silver hair. He took a deep, steadying breath before looking directly into my eyes. "What I found is significantly worse than we could have ever possibly imagined. Julian is not just a domestic abuser, Chloe. He is not just struggling with debt. Your husband is orchestrating a massive, highly sophisticated federal wire fraud and money laundering operation, and he is using your pristine financial identity as the primary shield." The air vanished entirely from my lungs. "What do you mean?" I choked out, staring blindly at the stacks of paper. Harrison picked up a thick stack of documents featuring official bank logos and heavy notary stamps. He slid them toward me. "Look at these signatures, Chloe." I looked down at the highlighted lines. There, scrawled perfectly across the bottom of 3 different commercial mortgage agreements, was my name, Chloe Myers, but I had not signed these papers. The signature was a flawless, masterful forgery. Next to each signature was a bright blue notary public stamp, verifying my identity. "I did not sign these," I said, panic rising sharply in my chest. "I have never seen these documents in my entire life." "I know you did not," Harrison said gravely. My forensic contact confirmed it. Julian has a counterfeit notary stamp. He has been taking out massive multi-million-dollar secret mortgages on commercial properties using your name, your pristine credit score, and your stolen identity. He secures the massive loans, heavily over-leveraging the properties, and then he immediately wires the cash out to offshore limited liability companies before the banks realize the properties are financially underwater. My head was spinning so violently, I thought I might physically pass out. "But where's the money going?" I asked, gripping the edges of the folding table to anchor myself to reality. The bank told me $250,000 was wired to a wellness brand. Harrison's expression turned incredibly cold. "That is the money laundering pipeline." He pulled out a complex flowchart his contact had drawn up. "He is filtering the stolen loan money through Bethany's fake lifestyle company. Bethany's wellness brand is nothing but a registered shell corporation. They generate fake invoices for consulting services and holistic products that do not actually exist. Julian wires the fraudulently obtained bank loans to Bethany's company, effectively washing the dirty money. Then, Bethany transfers the clean cash directly back to Julian's hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands." I stared at the intricate web of arrows and dollar signs connecting my husband and his entitled sister. It was a massive, highly coordinated criminal conspiracy, and I was the unwitting financial blood supply funding the entire operation. They were not just stealing my money, they were setting me up to take the ultimate fall. "Julian is drawing a massive, untraceable salary from these offshore accounts." Harrison explained, his voice hard as steel. "He is living like an absolute king on stolen federal funds. And because all of the primary loans and the original property deeds are forged strictly in your name, you are the one holding the bag." The sheer magnitude of the betrayal washed over me in a crushing, suffocating wave. My own husband was systematically destroying my life, padding his secret offshore bank accounts, and preparing to leave me completely ruined. Bethany was in on it. She mocked my nursing salary while actively laundering the money Julian was stealing in my name. They were ruthless, calculated monsters, wearing designer clothes and bright, charismatic smiles. "We have to go to the police," I said frantically, reaching for my purse. "We have to take this to the local precinct right now. We have the proof. We can show them everything." Harrison slammed his hand down flat on the table. The loud, sharp crack echoed through the empty room, startling me. "No, he said firmly, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute terrifying intensity. "We cannot just walk into a local police station with this, Chloe. This is a massive federal crime. If you walk into a precinct right now without absolute legal protection, the moment the federal banks discover the systemic fraud, you will be arrested immediately as his primary co-conspirator." What I gasped, the terror paralyzing my throat. But I am the victim. I did not know anything about this. Harrison's face softened slightly, but his voice remained deadly serious. "The law does not care about what you knew, Chloe. The law cares about whose name is on the forged documents. The money originated from your joint accounts. The fraudulent loans are secured against your personal credit. Bethany is living in your guest house. To any federal prosecutor looking at this paper trail, you look exactly like the mastermind of a massive money laundering ring. If Julian senses that the authorities are closing in, he will instantly drain those offshore accounts, flee the country, and leave you to take the full blame. You will go to federal prison for 20 years, and he will disappear with millions." Tears spilled hot and fast down my cheeks. "I am completely trapped," I sobbed, burying my face in my trembling hands. "There is no way out of this. He has thought of absolutely everything. I am going to lose my nursing license. I am going to go to prison." "You are not going to prison," Harrison said, his voice a low, steady rumble of absolute authority. "I did not spend 35 years dismantling violent criminals just to let a silver-tongued real estate con artist destroy my niece. We are not going to run Chloe. We are going to completely obliterate him. We are going to dismantle his fake empire so publicly and so thoroughly that he will never see the outside of a federal penitentiary ever again." I looked up, wiping my wet cheeks. How I asked desperately, how do we fight someone who controls absolutely everything? "We use his own arrogance to build a flawless trap," Harrison explained, leaning forward into the harsh light of the construction lamp. "I have already contacted a trusted colleague in the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They are quietly reviewing these files right now. But federal investigations take months to build, and we do not have months." Harrison pointed a thick finger at a specific bank statement on the table. "Look at this date, Chloe. Julian has scheduled another massive fraudulent wire transfer for exactly 4 days from now. It is timed perfectly to coincide with his massive investor launch gala this coming weekend. He is planning to secure millions in legitimate venture capital during the gala, mix it with the fraudulent loan money, wash it all through Bethany's shell company on Monday morning, and then completely vanish. If that transfer clears, the financial damage will be irreversible, and you will be permanently tied to the federal crimes. 4 days. I repeated, my voice shaking violently. "We have exactly 4 days to stop him." Harrison nodded grimly. "We have exactly 4 days to secure an emergency federal asset freeze, obtain a sealed indictment, and get a federal judge to sign a no-knock arrest warrant based on both the undeniable proof of systemic wire fraud and the extensive domestic battery he has inflicted on you. We have to completely sever his access to the money and his physical freedom in one single, perfectly coordinated strike." "What do I have to do?" I asked, the terror slowly morphing into a cold, hardened determination. Harrison looked at me, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of immense pride and deep sorrow. "You have to go back into that house, Chloe. You have to endure 4 more days of living with a monster. You must act completely submissive, entirely defeated, and totally ignorant of what is about to happen. Julian is hosting a massive launch gala at your home this weekend. He expects you to play the perfect, obedient wife in front of his wealthy investors. You have to play that role flawlessly. You must not give him a single reason to suspect that the walls are rapidly closing in around him." I swallowed hard, imagining 4 more days of his cruel insults, his terrifying threats, and his heavy fists. It felt like an impossible mountain to climb, but as I looked at the forged signatures on the table, I realized that shrinking myself was no longer an option. Shrinking had nearly cost me my life, and it was currently costing me my freedom. I was a 31-year-old pediatric oncology nurse. I spent my days fighting for the lives of vulnerable children. It was finally time to fight for my own life with the exact same ruthless ferocity. "I will do it." I said, my voice dropping an octave, finding a steady, unbreakable rhythm. I will play the perfect smiling wife. I will serve his drinks, I will iron his expensive suits, and I will watch his arrogant face closely while we count down the absolute final hours of his pathetic, fraudulent empire. Harrison smiled. It was a cold, dangerous smile that promised absolute devastation for the man who had hurt me. Good, he said softly. Now go home, Chloe. The trap is officially set, and by sunrise on Sunday, Julian Myers is going to lose absolutely everything. The next 4 days felt like a masterclass in psychological endurance. I was a ghost haunting my own custom-built prison, moving through the massive rooms with my head down and my voice barely above a whisper. I ironed Julian's shirts with meticulous care. I cooked intricate meals and served them to him and Bethany on the stone patio, enduring their condescending remarks without a single word of protest. Every time Julian barked an order or made a cruel joke at my expense, I forced a submissive smile, playing the exact role he expected. But underneath the heavy theatrical concealer and the terrified facade, my mind was sharp, calculating every single hour until the trap snapped shut. Julian became increasingly erratic as the weekend approached. The investor launch gala was his crowning achievement the moment he planned to secure the final multi-million-dollar venture capital he needed before draining the accounts and vanishing. He paced the house, barking orders at the catering company, over the phone complaining about the floral arrangements and micromanaging every detail of the event. His stress translated into constant, terrifying pressure on me. He demanded perfection in everything I did, using the threat of physical violence to ensure absolute compliance. While Julian was distracted with his massive ego project, I was silently communicating with Uncle Harrison. The cheap burner phone became my lifeline. I kept it hidden inside a hollowed-out medical reference book on the bottom shelf of the guest room closet. Every night after Julian had fallen asleep, I would retrieve it and send Harrison a brief encrypted update. Harrison was moving with terrifying speed. On Thursday morning, he texted me from the burner phone. The FBI forensic team cracked the flash drive. The evidence of systemic wire fraud is undeniable. He forged your signature on 3 commercial properties and funneled the cash through Bethany's LLC. We have the proof. I read the text sitting on the edge of the guest bed, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might wake Julian down the hall. The next message arrived 2 minutes later. I brought in a colleague from the white-collar crime division. He's taking this directly to a federal judge this afternoon. We are securing a quiet emergency asset freeze alias pendens on all his properties and accounts. The judge is also signing a no-knock arrest warrant based on the federal fraud and the evidence of severe domestic battery. A no-knock arrest warrant. The words felt heavy and final. Julian was not just going to be sued, he was going to be taken down by federal agents. Stay strong. Chloe Harrison's final text read, "Do not give him any reason to suspect. The raid happens Sunday morning." Friday evening, the night before the gala, the tension in the house reached a boiling point. The caterers had arrived early to set up the outdoor tents and arrange the ballroom-style seating in the grand foyer. Julian was frantic, yelling at the event planner and demanding that the champagne tower be moved 3 inches to the left. I stayed out of his way, quietly organizing the guest bathroom and making sure the luxury soaps were perfectly aligned. Around 9 p.m., the catering crew left, and the house fell into an uneasy silence. Bethany had gone out to a networking dinner in her new Range Rover, leaving Julian and me alone. I was in the master bedroom, carefully pressing Julian's custom tuxedo for the gala. The heavy iron glided over the crisp fabric, the steam rising in the quiet room. I was exhausted, my ribs aching, and my jaw throbbing from the constant tension. Julian walked into the bedroom, holding a crystal glass of scotch. He didn't say a word. He just stood near the doorway watching me iron. The air in the room instantly grew thick and suffocating. "Is this the shirt?" he asked, his voice low and tight. "Yes, Julian," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the ironing board. "It's perfectly pressed." He walked over and snatched the shirt from the hanger. He held it up to the light, inspecting it with a critical eye. Then he sighed, that sharp, impatient sound that always preceded violence. "There's a crease on the left cuff," he said coldly. "I'm sorry," I whispered, reaching for the shirt. "I'll fix it right now." He didn't hand it back. Instead, he threw the shirt onto the floor. You can't do anything right, can you, Chloe? He sneered. I ask for one simple thing, a perfectly pressed tuxedo for the most important night of my life, and you fail. You are completely useless. Before I could back away, he lunged forward, grabbing my upper arm right over the heavy bruise he had left days earlier. The pain was blinding. I gasped, dropping the iron onto the board with a loud clatter. He shoved me hard against the heavy oak dresser. The impact rattled my teeth and sent a fresh wave of agony through my bruised ribs. Look at me. He hissed, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and raw malice. I looked up, tears stinging my eyes. Tomorrow night, you are going to smile, he commanded, his fingers digging deeper into my arm. You are going to look beautiful, and you are going to tell every single investor in this house how lucky you are to be married to me. Because if you embarrass me, Chloe, if you say one wrong word, I will make sure you never see the inside of that hospital again. Do you understand? He didn't just want my compliance. He wanted my absolute submission. He wanted to break me completely before he threw me away. But as I looked into his cold, empty eyes, I realized something profound. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. The terror had burned away, leaving only a cold, hardened resolve. He was a monster, yes, but he was a monster standing on a trapdoor, and I held the lever. I understand, Julian, I whispered, forcing the tears to fall, playing the perfect broken victim one last time. I won't embarrass you, I promise. He held me there for one more agonizing second, reveling in his absolute control. Then he shoved me away, turned on his heel, and walked out of the room, locking the heavy bedroom door behind him. I stood in the silent room, the pain radiating through my body. I walked over to the mirror and looked at my reflection. The heavy makeup couldn't hide the exhaustion, but beneath it all, my eyes were clear. The trap was set. The evidence was secured. The federal judge had signed the warrant. Julian Myers thought he was the smartest man in the room, but he had underestimated the invisible woman he had spent 2 years trying to destroy. Tomorrow, he was going to lose everything. The Friday before the massive investor launch gala began with a suffocating tension that settled over the entire property like a heavy winter fog. From the moment the sun rose over the manicured lawns of our gated community, Julian was a completely different person. The charming, charismatic real estate developer vanished, replaced by a frantic, obsessive tyrant. The caterers arrived at 8 in the morning to begin assembling the massive white tents on the back patio. Event planners rushed through the glass corridors, carrying floral arrangements and crystal centerpieces. Julian micromanaged every single detail with a terrifying intensity. He screamed at the head florist because the white roses were the wrong shade of ivory. He threatened to fire the catering director over the placement of the champagne tower. I stayed entirely out of his way, navigating the chaotic house like a silent ghost. I wore my faded navy blue nursing scrubs blending into the background, organizing the guest bathrooms and making absolutely sure the expensive hand towels were perfectly aligned. Bethany, of course, was absolutely zero help. She spent the entire morning lounging in the guest house, complaining loudly about the noise from the construction crew, and ordering me to bring her fresh coffee every hour. I obeyed every single command without a single word of protest. I kept my eyes lowered. I plastered a timid, submissive smile on my face. But beneath that carefully constructed facade of absolute defeat, my mind was running with the precision of a ticking clock. Every time I walked past Julian, I could feel the violent energy radiating off his body. He was under immense financial pressure. He needed this launch gala to be absolutely flawless because he was planning to secure millions of dollars in legitimate venture capital from the wealthy investors attending tomorrow. He was going to mix their clean money with the fraudulent commercial loans he had stolen, using my identity, wash it all through Bethany's fake wellness brand on Monday morning, and then completely vanish. He thought he was a criminal mastermind playing a flawless game. He had absolutely no idea that a federal judge had already signed a quiet emergency asset freeze and a no-knock arrest warrant. He had no idea that his entire empire was currently sitting on a fragile trapdoor, and I was the one holding the lever. By 7 in the evening, the event staff finally packed up their equipment and left the property. The massive house fell into an eerie, echoing silence. Bethany announced she was going out for a networking dinner downtown in her brand new luxury vehicle, leaving Julian and me completely alone in the 6,000 square foot mansion. The isolation was terrifying, but it was also exactly what I needed. I went into the guest bedroom closet and retrieved the cheap prepaid burner phone from its hiding place inside a hollowed-out medical textbook. My hands were shaking so violently, I could barely press the small plastic buttons. I had received a text message from Uncle Harrison an hour earlier. The message was simple and absolute. "We are ready. Do not engage him, but if he corners you, make sure the line is open." I slipped the small black phone into the deep right pocket of my thick cardigan. I blindly dialed the emergency direct line Harrison had set up with the local police dispatcher and the Federal Bureau of Investigation Task Force. I felt the phone vibrate once, signaling the call had connected to the secure server. I left the line completely open. Everything that happened next would be recorded. Everything he said would be transmitted directly to the authorities waiting patiently in the dark. I walked slowly into the master bedroom. The space was cold and pristine, smelling of expensive cologne and lingering dread. Julian's custom-tailored $4,000 tuxedo was hanging on the heavy oak closet door. He had ordered me to iron the crisp white dress shirt and polish his leather shoes. I set up the ironing board near the window, the heavy steam rising into the quiet room. My bruised ribs ached with every movement. The dark purple marks on my bicep throbbed under my clothes. I was physically exhausted, drained from days of severe psychological torture, but my mind was crystal clear. I pressed the hot iron against the expensive cotton fabric, making sure every single crease was absolutely flawless. I needed to be perfect. I needed to give him absolutely no excuse to hurt me. But monsters do not need excuses. They only need opportunities. I heard his heavy footsteps, marching purposefully down the hardwood hallway. The sound was distinct, rhythmic, and filled with aggressive intention. My heart instantly jumped directly into my throat. The hot iron trembled in my grip. Julian stepped into the master bedroom. He was holding a crystal glass filled with amber scotch. His face was flushed, his eyes dark and empty of anything remotely human. He did not say a word at first. He just stood in the doorway, staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. Then slowly and deliberately, he reached behind him and pushed the heavy mahogany door closed. The brass deadbolt clicked with a sharp, metallic snap. The sound echoed through the large room like a prison cell locking shut. "Is the shirt ready, Chloe?" His voice was a deadly, quiet hiss that made the blood freeze entirely solid in my veins. "Yes, Julian," I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the ironing board. "I just finished pressing the collar. It is perfectly ready for tomorrow." He walked slowly across the thick carpet. He did not take the shirt from the hanger. Instead, he grabbed the fabric of the sleeve and inspected it under the bright vanity lights. He took a slow sip of his scotch, the ice clinking loudly in the crystal glass. He sighed, a sharp, impatient sound that always preceded extreme violence. "There is a slight wrinkle on the left cuff," he said coldly. I blinked, genuinely confused. I looked at the pristine fabric. There was absolutely nothing there. It was perfectly smooth. "I am so sorry," I stammered, taking a small step backward. "I will fix it right now. Let me just heat the iron again." He threw the expensive shirt directly onto the floor. "You cannot do a single thing right, can you?" His voice began to rise, the suppressed rage finally breaking through his charismatic facade. "I ask you for one simple task. One perfectly pressed tuxedo for the most critical night of my entire professional career, and you fail completely. You are utterly useless." Before I could even raise my hands to protect my face, Julian lunged forward. He dropped his crystal glass onto the carpet and grabbed me by the shoulders, shoving me backward with terrifying force. My spine slammed hard against the heavy oak dresser. The impact rattled my teeth and sent a blinding wave of agony shooting through my bruised ribs. I gasped for air, my hands frantically grasping at the polished wood behind me to stay upright. "Look at me," he demanded, stepping directly into my personal space and pinning me against the furniture. I forced my terrified eyes to meet his. He was smiling a cruel, predatory grin that made my stomach turn over. He loved this. He loved the absolute power he held over my physical body. He loved watching me tremble. "Tomorrow night, you are going to put on that expensive dress I bought you," he sneered, his breath hot and smelling of alcohol. "You are going to walk through this house with a bright, beautiful smile on your pathetic face. You are going to serve drinks to my investors, and you are going to tell every single one of those wealthy men how incredibly lucky you are to be married to a man like me. Because if you embarrass me, Chloe, if you say one wrong word or drop a single glass, I will make sure you never walk out of this house again. I am not going to embarrass you, Julian." I choked out tears spilling hot and fast down my cheeks. "I am playing the part perfectly. I signed the loan papers for you. I did everything you asked. Please just let me go." My words only fueled his immense arrogance. He laughed a dark, booming sound that echoed off the bedroom walls. "You think signing those papers was a favor to me?" He pressed his forearm heavily against my chest, crushing my breath. "You stupid, naive little nurse. You have absolutely no idea what is actually happening, do you?" I am completely untouchable. The burner phone in my pocket felt heavy. The line was open. He was talking directly to the federal authorities, and he was too completely blinded by his own narcissism to realize it. I needed him to say more. I needed him to confess everything. "What do you mean?" I whispered, letting my voice crack with pathetic desperation. "I saw the bank statement, Julian. You took out $250,000 in my name. You wired it to Bethany's wellness brand. You are stealing from me." Julian laughed again, throwing his head back. "Stealing from you? I own you, Chloe. I own this massive house. I own your pristine credit score, and I own your entire life. Do you honestly think that was the only loan? I have taken out 3 separate multi-million-dollar commercial mortgages using your forged signature and a fake notary stamp. The money is already washed clean through Bethany's shell corporation and sitting safely in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. By Monday morning, when those venture capitalists hand me their seed money, I am draining every single account and leaving you holding the bag." I stared at him, pretending to be utterly horrified. "You are committing federal wire fraud," I sobbed, shrinking further against the dresser. "You are laundering money. When the banks find out, they will send me to prison. They will take my nursing license. They will definitely send you to federal prison." Julian smiled, leaning in so close his nose brushed mine. "Because every single fraudulent document has your name on it. You are the perfect scapegoat, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop me. You have no money. You have no resources. You are completely trapped. I could go to the police." I cried out, testing his absolute confidence. "I could tell them what you are doing. I could show them the bruises you leave on me." Julian's eyes darkened instantly. The amusement vanished, replaced by a cold, homicidal fury. He pulled his right fist back and struck me hard across the left side of my jaw. The sheer force of the blow snapped my head to the side. A blinding flash of white light exploded behind my eyes. I collapsed onto the thick bedroom carpet, the metallic taste of fresh blood instantly filling my mouth. My ears were ringing so loudly, I could barely hear the rain hitting the windows outside. I lay on the floor, gasping for air, clutching my throbbing face. Julian stood over me, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, looking down at my bleeding body with absolute, unadulterated disgust. "Go ahead and call the police, Chloe," he mocked, his voice echoing above me. "Go ahead and tell them your wild stories. Who do you think they are going to believe? A wealthy, charismatic real estate developer hosting a gala for the most powerful men in the city, or a hysterical, crazy nurse who is already drowning in millions of dollars of fraudulent debt? They will laugh you right out of the precinct. I control the narrative. I control the money. And if you ever threaten to expose me again, I will not just ruin you financially. I will snap your neck and tell the authorities you tripped and fell down the grand staircase in a manic episode. They will believe me. They always believe me." I lay on the carpet, spitting a small pool of dark blood onto the pristine white fibers. The pain in my jaw was excruciating. I could feel the flesh swelling rapidly, a massive, undeniable bruise forming across the entire left side of my face. It was physical evidence that no amount of heavy theatrical concealer would ever be able to hide. Julian walked over to the bedroom door and unlocked the brass deadbolt. He turned back to look at me one final time. "Clean the blood off the carpet," he commanded effortlessly, "and put some ice on your face. You need to look pretty for the investors tomorrow. Do not make me tell you again." He stepped out into the hallway, pulling the heavy mahogany door shut behind him. His leather shoes clicked away down the corridor, leaving me entirely alone in the dark bedroom. The silence returned heavy and absolute. I lay on the floor for a long time, my cheek pressed against the soft carpet, listening to the steady rhythm of my own breathing. My jaw throbbed with a sickening heat. My ribs ached. My body was broken, bruised, and exhausted. I slowly reached my trembling hand into the deep pocket of my thick cardigan. My fingers brushed against the small plastic casing of the prepaid burner phone. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing digital screen. Call duration 12 minutes and 47 seconds. The line was still completely open. I brought the small microphone close to my bleeding lips. "Did you get all of that, Uncle Harrison?" I whispered into the quiet, dark room. The response came immediately, crackling softly through the tiny speaker. It was the deep, hardened voice of a retired state police detective standing in a room full of federal agents. "We got every single word," Chloe Harrison replied, his voice thick with emotion and absolute resolve. "The judge just authorized the final warrant. The tactical teams are assembling now. We are coming for him at sunrise." I pressed the end call button and let the phone drop onto the carpet beside me. I did not cry. For the first time in 2 agonizing years, there was absolutely no fear left in my body. Julian Myers had beaten me, threatened to kill me, and explicitly confessed to massive federal wire fraud, systemic money laundering, and severe domestic battery on a recorded federal line. He thought he was a brilliant prince ruling a flawless empire. He thought I was just a slow, pathetic, obedient workhorse, completely broken by his heavy fists. He had no idea that he had just handed a certified death warrant to a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I lay there in the dark, bleeding onto the expensive carpet he had bought with my stolen identity. My jaw was shattered. My life was in ruins, and my entire world was terrifyingly uncertain. But as I stared at the closed mahogany door, listening to the rain fall against the glass, I began to smile. It was a small, genuine, dangerous smile. The long nightmare was finally over. The trap had snapped entirely shut. And by tomorrow morning, the monster who thought he owned me was going to lose absolutely everything. Before we move into the explosive final reckoning, I need to ask you a question. Have you ever been in a situation where the person hurting you was so blinded by their own immense arrogance that they ended up destroying themselves? If you know how incredibly satisfying that moment of realization is, drop a comment and tell me about it. And if you are ready to see Julian dragged out of his own custom mansion in steel handcuffs, hit that like button and make sure you are subscribed. The sunrise is coming, and trust me, justice has never looked so beautiful. The sun had not yet risen over the pristine manicured lawns of our exclusive gated community. It was exactly 5:30 in the morning on the day of the massive investor launch gala. The sprawling 6,000 square foot modern mansion was entirely quiet, wrapped in the heavy stillness that precedes a major storm. The caterers were scheduled to arrive at 8 o'clock sharp to begin setting up the outdoor bars and the extravagant champagne towers. I was standing in the center of the dark master bedroom, completely fully dressed in my navy blue nursing scrubs. My left jaw throbbed with a sickening, relentless heat where Julian had struck me the night before. The entire side of my face was swollen and dark purple, a brutal physical manifestation of his absolute control. But I did not reach for my heavy-duty theatrical concealer this morning. I let the ugly, undeniable bruise remain completely exposed to the cold morning air. Down the hall in the massive marble master bathroom, I could hear the water running. Julian was awake. He was standing in front of the massive double vanity mirrors, meticulously shaving his handsome face. He hummed a cheerful, upbeat tune as the expensive steel razor scraped against his jawline. He was in an incredibly fantastic mood. In his arrogant, narcissistic mind today was the day he officially secured his multi-million-dollar empire. He genuinely believed that by tonight, he would be standing in our glass foyer accepting massive checks from wealthy venture capitalists, completely ready to launder the clean money through his sister's fake wellness brand and vanish with my stolen financial identity. He had absolutely no idea that his entire meticulously planned future had an expiration date of roughly 10 minutes. I walked slowly, quietly out of the master bedroom and stood at the top of the grand glass staircase. The house was freezing cold. Downstairs in the pristine chef's kitchen, I heard the loud, sharp sound of ceramic hitting granite. Bethany was awake too. She had walked over from the guest house wearing her pure silk designer loungewear. She was loudly opening cabinets and slamming drawers, completely annoyed that the automated espresso machine was out of imported coffee beans. "Chloe," she yelled, her entitled voice echoing up the grand staircase. "Chloe, where's the dark roast coffee? I am not drinking this cheap generic garbage you bought. Get down here and make me a proper latte before the catering staff arrives." I stood perfectly still at the top of the stairs, my hands gripping the cold steel banister. I did not answer her. I did not move a single muscle to obey her arrogant command. For the first time in 2 agonizing years, I simply listened to her complain and felt absolutely zero fear. The deep, paralyzing terror that had ruled my entire existence had completely evaporated overnight. It had been entirely replaced by a cold-hardened, absolute certainty. I looked through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that made up the front wall of our custom-built prison. The private road leading up to our long driveway was completely shrouded in the thick gray morning fog. And then, piercing through the heavy coastal fog, I saw them. There were no loud wailing sirens. There were no blaring horns to announce their sudden arrival. There was only the absolute terrifying silence of a highly coordinated tactical strike. First, one dark sport utility vehicle pulled smoothly into the long, pristine driveway. Then another. Then 3 more. Heavy armored vans and marked police cruisers completely blocked the entrance to the property, shutting off any possible avenue of escape. Red and blue emergency lights began to flash silently, illuminating the thick gray fog and casting long, frantic colored shadows across the perfectly manicured front lawn. The flashing lights reflected violently against the massive glass windows of the mansion, turning the dark grand foyer into a chaotic kaleidoscope of red and blue. Dozens of heavily armed tactical officers and federal agents poured out of the vehicles with terrifying synchronized speed. They wore dark, heavy tactical gear with the Federal Bureau of Investigation insignia, clearly printed across their backs in bright yellow letters. Local state police officers moved rapidly alongside them, securing the entire perimeter of the massive property. They surrounded the guest house. They secured the back patio. They moved up the stone pathway toward the heavy oak front door, with their weapons drawn and their tactical shields raised. Bethany finally noticed the flashing colored lights reflecting off the granite kitchen island. She stopped complaining about the coffee. I heard her walking slowly toward the front of the house, her silk slippers padding softly against the hardwood floor. "Julian, what is going on outside?" She called out, her voice laced with sudden, deep confusion. "Julian, why are there police cars in the driveway?" Before Julian could even turn off the running water in the master bathroom, the heavy, absolute silence of the morning was violently shattered. "Police search warrant, open the door immediately." A booming, amplified voice echoed through a heavy megaphone outside. Bethany let out a loud, confused shriek. She backed away from the front windows, dropping her ceramic coffee mug onto the pristine stone floor. It shattered into a dozen sharp pieces, but the sound was instantly drowned out by what happened next. They did not wait for Julian to come downstairs. They did not wait for anyone to politely unlock the heavy brass deadbolt. A massive heavy steel battering ram struck the solid oak front door with a deafening, explosive thud. The entire front wall of the house literally shook from the sheer extreme force of the violent impact. Wood splintered and cracked loudly. The expensive brass deadbolt, the exact same lock Julian used to trap me inside and punish me, was completely ripped from its heavy hinges. The massive door flew open, crashing violently against the interior wall and shattering the expensive modern artwork hanging in the grand foyer. Federal agents and tactical police officers flooded into the house like a relentless dark tide. They moved with absolute overwhelming authority, shouting clear, loud commands that echoed off the high ceilings. "Get your hands up. Do not move. Secure the kitchen. Clear the downstairs rooms." Bethany screamed a high-pitched, hysterical sound of pure, unadulterated terror. She fell to her knees on the cold marble floor of the foyer, covering her head with her trembling hands, as 3 heavily armed federal agents immediately surrounded her, shouting for her to stay completely still on the ground. Upstairs, the master bathroom door flew open and banged loudly against the hallway wall. Julian ran out into the corridor wearing only his expensive silk bathrobe, his face still half covered in thick white shaving cream. He looked completely, wildly disoriented. The arrogant, charming real estate developer was entirely gone, replaced by a frantic, terrified man whose perfect fake reality had just been violently torn apart. "What is the meaning of this?" He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with panic and absolute fury. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am hosting a major financial gala here today. You are trespassing on private property. Get out of my house right now, before I sue every single one of you." He stormed toward the top of the grand staircase, preparing to unleash his massive, entitled rage on the officers below. But as he reached the landing, he suddenly froze completely dead in his tracks. Standing right beside me at the top of the stairs, having quietly let himself in through the back patio door, was Uncle Harrison. My uncle was wearing his old, worn leather jacket, his silver hair neatly combed, his piercing gray eyes locked directly onto Julian. He held a thick manila folder in his strong right hand. He did not look like a friendly visiting relative anymore. He looked exactly like the hardened veteran state police detective he had been for 35 years. Julian stared at Harrison, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Then his dark, frantic eyes slowly shifted over to me. I was standing perfectly still beside my uncle, my arms resting calmly at my sides. The bright, flashing red and blue emergency lights from outside illuminated the massive dark purple and yellow bruise covering the entire left side of my jaw. Julian looked at my face. He looked at the undeniable physical evidence of his severe brutality, completely exposed for dozens of federal agents and police officers to see clearly. He looked back down at the officers swarming his pristine grand foyer, seizing his expensive computers and placing his screaming sister into heavy steel handcuffs. I watched the exact moment Julian Myers realized his entire life was completely, permanently over. It was incredible to witness. The absolute extreme arrogance, the violent, overwhelming power, the deep narcissistic belief that he was entirely untouchable. It all completely drained out of his body in a single second. The blood rushed from his handsome face, leaving him looking pale, sickly, and entirely pathetic. His broad shoulders slumped forward. The expensive silk bathrobe suddenly looked ridiculous on his shaking, terrified frame. He realized with absolute devastating clarity that I had not been a quiet, obedient workhorse for the past 4 days. I had been the silent architect of his absolute destruction. Julian the monster, who had cornered me in hallways, threatened to snap my neck, and bragged about stealing my financial identity, slowly backed away from the top of the stairs. His knees buckled underneath him. He collapsed onto the expensive, thick carpet of the hallway, dropping entirely down onto his knees right in front of me. The federal agents were rapidly advancing up the grand staircase, their heavy boots thudding loudly against the glass and steel steps. Julian did not look at the approaching officers. He looked up at me from the floor. And in a split second, he completely changed his entire strategy. The violent tyrant vanished, and the desperate, charismatic manipulator returned, trying frantically to salvage whatever tiny piece of leverage he thought he still had. "Chloe," he gasped, his voice trembling with manufactured emotional agony. Tears actually began to well up in his dark, empty eyes, spilling over his cheeks and mixing with the white shaving cream. "Chloe, please, you have to tell them this is a massive misunderstanding. Please, baby, you have to stop them." He reached out with a shaking hand and desperately grabbed the hem of my navy blue nursing scrubs, his fingers clutching the cheap fabric like it was a life preserver. "I did not mean to hurt you last night," he sobbed, his voice rising in a pathetic, desperate pitch for the officers to hear. I was just so stressed about the launch gala. The financial pressure has been absolutely destroying me, Chloe. I am sick. I am not in my right mind. You know I love you. You know I would never intentionally do anything to harm our marriage. Please tell your uncle to call them off. Tell them I will give the money back. I will change, Chloe. I swear to God, I will completely change. I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor, clutching my clothes and crying like a terrified child. This was the same man who had laughed in my face while bragging about leaving me millions of dollars in fraudulent debt. This was the same man who had shoved me into a heavy oak dresser and promised to murder me if I ever called the police. He honestly believed that because I had spent 2 years shrinking myself to accommodate his massive ego, I would shrink myself one last time to save him from federal prison. He genuinely believed that my deep, profound empathy as a nurse made me weak enough to forgive his absolute monstrosity. I did not step away from him. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply looked down into his desperate, pleading eyes, and I felt absolutely nothing. The lead federal agent reached the top of the stairs. He was a tall, imposing man wearing a dark suit under his heavy, tactical vest. He completely ignored Julian's pathetic sobbing. He stepped forward and looked directly at Uncle Harrison. Detective Harrison, the federal agent, said, his voice carrying absolute professional respect over the chaotic noise of the house. "We have the perimeter completely secured. We have located the secondary suspect, Bethany Myers, in the foyer, and we have seized all electronic devices from the home office exactly as indicated in your intelligence report." Harrison nodded slowly, handing the thick manila folder to the federal agent. "Good work, agent. You will find the verified original copies of the forged commercial loan documents, the counterfeit notary stamp, and the complete routing numbers for the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands right there in the file. The digital audio confession is already logged on your secure servers." Julian gasped loudly, releasing his grip on my scrubs and falling back onto his heels. His tear-streaked face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. "Audio confession?" Julian whispered, his voice barely a weak, breathless rasp. "What audio confession?" I finally looked directly down into his eyes. My voice was incredibly calm, perfectly steady, and entirely cold. "The burner phone was in my cardigan pocket last night, Julian," I said softly, making absolutely sure he heard every single word over the shouting officers downstairs. "You left the deadbolt locked, but the line was completely open. The Federal Bureau of Investigation heard every single word you said about laundering the commercial loans through Bethany's shell company. They heard you admit to forging my signature, and they heard the exact sound your heavy fist made when it shattered my jaw." Julian stared at me, his jaw hanging completely slack. The fake tears instantly stopped falling. The realization of what I had accomplished, the sheer magnitude of the trap I had built, completely paralyzed his mind. He was not looking at a terrified, submissive nurse anymore. He was looking at the incredibly dangerous, highly intelligent woman who had just systematically dismantled his entire life without making a single sound. "You did this!" He choked out, his voice shaking with absolute horror. "You destroyed everything." "I did not destroy anything, Julian," I replied, my voice echoing with quiet, absolute finality in the chaotic hallway. "I simply stopped paying for your illusions. You destroyed yourself." The lead federal agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "Julian Myers," he commanded, his voice booming with absolute legal authority. "You are under federal arrest for systemic wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and complex money laundering. You are also being charged by local authorities with felony domestic battery." 2 heavily armed officers stepped up beside the federal agent, grabbing Julian firmly by both of his arms and violently hauling him up off the expensive hallway carpet. Julian did not fight them. The fight had been completely drained out of him. He hung limply between the two massive tactical officers, his expensive silk bathrobe slipping off his shoulder, his face pale and entirely defeated. He looked exactly like the pathetic, weak monster he had always truly been, underneath his expensive tailored suits and his charismatic lies. As the officers turned him around to march him down the grand glass staircase, Julian looked back over his shoulder at me one absolutely final time. His dark eyes were wide and filled with a profound, devastating terror. He finally realized that the launch gala was completely over. The venture capital money was gone. His offshore accounts were entirely frozen. His fake wellness brand laundering sister was going to federal prison right alongside him, and the woman he had treated like a worthless appliance had just handed him a certified federal death sentence. "Take him out of my house," I said quietly, turning my back on him completely. I walked over to the large hallway window and stood beside Uncle Harrison, looking out at the thick gray morning fog. Down below in the pristine driveway, the catering vans were just beginning to arrive for the massive launch gala. The catering staff stepped out of their vehicles, holding trays of expensive caviar and imported flowers, stopping completely dead in their tracks as they watched the federal agents drag the wealthy, charismatic real estate developer out the shattered front door in heavy steel handcuffs. The sun was finally beginning to rise over the distant horizon, burning away the thick gray fog and casting a bright, clean light across the perfectly manicured lawns. I took a deep, long, shuddering breath, filling my lungs with the fresh, cold air. My jaw still throbbed with intense pain, but for the first time in 2 agonizing years, I knew that the healing could finally officially begin. The monster was completely gone. The heavy glass cage was shattered, and my beautiful free life was entirely waiting for me on the other side. I took my first step down the grand glass staircase. The thick, heavy glass felt incredibly cold beneath my trembling hands. The entire grand foyer of the custom-built mansion was swarming with federal agents and tactical police officers. The heavy oak front door had been completely shattered by a heavy steel battering ram, leaving jagged pieces of expensive wood scattered across the pristine marble floor. The crisp, freezing morning air poured into the house, carrying the damp scent of coastal fog and sweeping away the suffocating tension that had trapped me for 2 agonizing years. Red and blue emergency lights flashed silently in the driveway, casting long, frantic, colored shadows against the soaring white walls. It looked like a violent, chaotic storm had finally broken inside my personal prison. And right in the center of that storm, kneeling on the cold marble floor in his expensive silk bathrobe, was the monster who had promised to murder me just 8 hours earlier. Julian was looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. His handsome face was pale and covered in patches of white shaving cream. He was shaking uncontrollably. I continued walking slowly, deliberately down the steps. With every single step, I took a piece of the invisible heavy chain wrapped around my chest, snapped, and fell away. I reached into the deep pocket of my navy blue nursing scrubs and pulled out a simple white makeup wipe. I had kept it with me all morning, waiting for this exact, absolute moment. I reached the bottom of the staircase and stood just a few feet away from my husband. The federal agents surrounding him parted slightly, giving me a clear, unobstructed path. I raised the white makeup wipe to my jawline. I pressed it firmly against my skin and wiped away the thick, heavy layers of theatrical concealer I had applied so desperately the night before. I wiped away the orange color corrector and the flesh-toned foundation. I wiped away 2 years of absolute silence, 2 years of performing the perfect, flawless wife, 2 years of shrinking myself to survive his extreme physical violence. I dropped the stained makeup wipe onto the pristine marble floor. Exposed to the harsh flashing emergency lights and the steady gaze of dozens of law enforcement officers was the massive, dark purple and sickly yellow bruise covering the entire left side of my face. The brutal, undeniable physical evidence of his severe domestic battery was finally completely visible to the world. A heavy, profound silence fell over the grand foyer. The tactical officers stared at the horrifying injury on my face, and their expressions hardened into cold, professional fury. Uncle Harrison stood quietly behind me, his presence a steady, immovable mountain of absolute support. Julian stared at the massive bruise on my jaw, and his entire body seemed to deflate. The charismatic, wealthy real estate developer was completely gone. The arrogant predator who had pinned me against the heavy oak dresser and laughed about stealing my financial identity had entirely vanished. In his place was a desperate, pathetic coward, realizing for the very first time that he had lost absolute control of his fake narrative. "Chloe, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. He shuffled forward on his knees, his expensive leather slippers scraping against the marble floor. He reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the hem of my cheap navy blue nursing scrubs. He clung to the fabric like a drowning man clutching a fragile life preserver. "Chloe, baby, please, you have to tell them to stop. Tell them this is a massive misunderstanding." Tears streamed down his pale cheeks, cutting wet paths through the white shaving cream. He was crying real tears now, but they were not tears of genuine remorse. They were tears of pure, unadulterated terror for his own impending consequences. I was just so stressed about the investor gala. He sobbed loudly, making absolutely sure the federal agents could hear his manufactured emotional agony. "The financial pressure has been completely destroying my mind, Chloe. I am sick. I am not thinking clearly. I never meant to hurt you last night. You know I love you more than anything in this entire world. Please tell your uncle to call off the agents. Tell them we can work this out privately as a family. I will completely change Chloe. I swear to God, I will be the perfect husband from now on." I looked down at the man begging on his knees at my feet. For 2 agonizing years, I had genuinely believed that my deep, profound empathy was my greatest weakness. I had believed that because I was a pediatric oncology nurse trained to comfort and heal, I was somehow fundamentally flawed for staying with a man who caused so much pain. Julian had ruthlessly weaponized my compassion against me. He had used my pristine credit score, my stolen life savings, and my desperate desire to fix him to fund his massive fraudulent empire. But standing there in the cold morning air, looking down into his desperate, pleading eyes, I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no fear, no lingering emotional attachment. The monster was completely, entirely hollow. "You mistook my love for weakness." "Julian," I said, my voice incredibly calm, perfectly steady, and entirely cold. The sound of my voice echoed clearly through the silent foyer, cutting through his pathetic sobbing like a sharp steel blade. "You thought that because I am kind, because I heal people for a living, I would simply lie down and let you destroy my entire life." He stared up at me, his jaw hanging completely slack. "You bragged about how completely trapped I was." I continued stepping slightly closer to him, forcing him to look directly at the massive dark bruise he had put on my face. "You thought I was just a quiet, obedient workhorse you could use to fund your fake lifestyle and your sister's fake wellness brand. You thought the police would never believe a crazy nurse over a wealthy, charismatic developer. But you forgot one very important detail, Julian. You forgot that you were confessing to massive federal wire fraud, systemic money laundering, and severe domestic battery on a recorded federal line." Julian gasped loudly, releasing his desperate grip on my scrubs and falling back onto his heels. The absolute magnitude of what I had accomplished, the flawless trap I had built, completely paralyzed his mind. "I did not destroy you, Julian," I said quietly, offering him absolute finality. "I simply stopped paying for your expensive illusions. You completely destroyed yourself." The lead Federal Bureau of Investigation agent, a tall, imposing man wearing a heavy, dark tactical vest, stepped forward. He completely ignored Julian's pathetic state. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick stack of official legal documents sealed with heavy federal stamps. Julian Myers, the federal agent, commanded, his voice booming with absolute, unyielding legal authority. "You are currently under federal arrest for systemic wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and complex money laundering. You are also being charged by local state authorities with felony domestic battery." The agent tossed the thick federal indictment directly onto the marble floor at Julian's knees. The heavy papers scattered across the floor, mixing with the shattered wood from the broken front door. "No," Julian whispered, shaking his head frantically back and forth. "No, this cannot be happening. I have investors arriving tonight. I have a massive gala to host. You cannot do this to me." Over in the pristine chef's kitchen, a loud hysterical shriek pierced the morning air. Bethany, my deeply entitled sister-in-law, was being forcefully escorted into the grand foyer by two female federal agents. She was still wearing her pure silk designer loungewear, but her slender wrists were now firmly secured behind her back in heavy steel handcuffs. "Get your hands off me!" Bethany screamed, thrashing wildly against the agent's strong grips. "I did not do anything wrong. I am a lifestyle coach. I own a wellness brand. You cannot arrest me." One of the federal agents firmly guided Bethany toward the shattered front door, completely unfazed by her dramatic screaming. Bethany spotted Julian kneeling on the floor, and her entire demeanor shifted from entitled outrage to vicious, frantic self-preservation. "Tell them, Julian!" She shrieked, her face red and contorted with panic. "Tell them I did not know where the money came from. You told me it was a corporate restructuring loan. You told me to transfer the cash to the offshore accounts. I did not know it was stolen from Chloe. Tell them I am completely innocent." A third federal agent walked past Bethany carrying a large, clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag, I could clearly see Bethany's expensive designer cell phone, her pristine white leather wallet, and the gleaming silver keys to her brand new luxury sport utility vehicle. Everything she had bought with my stolen financial identity was being systematically seized as direct evidence of a massive federal crime. "My life is ruined," Bethany sobbed loudly as the agents pushed her out the front door and down the stone pathway toward a waiting armored transport van. She did not care about her older brother. She did not care about the severe physical violence he had inflicted on me. She only cared that her fake luxury ride was officially, permanently over. The sound of Bethany being shoved into the back of the transport van seemed to finally snap Julian out of his paralyzed state of shock. The desperate, pleading coward vanished in an instant, seamlessly replaced by the violent, unhinged predator I knew so well. He realized with absolute terrifying clarity that his massive fake empire was completely gone. The venture capital money was never coming. His offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were entirely frozen. His pristine reputation was completely shattered. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. "You ungrateful, parasitic parasite!" he roared, his voice dropping into a guttural, terrifying snarl. Julian lunged forward off the marble floor, launching his entire heavy body directly at me. His hands were outstretched, his fingers curled into violent claws aimed straight for my throat. His eyes were wide and completely devoid of human reason. He wanted to kill me right there in front of dozens of armed federal agents. He never even made it halfway. Before Julian could even close the short distance between us, 3 heavily armed tactical police officers tackled him violently to the ground. The sheer extreme physical force of their combined weight slammed Julian face first into the cold, hard marble tiles. The impact sounded like a heavy sack of concrete dropping from a great height. Julian screamed in pain and absolute furious rage, thrashing wildly beneath the heavy tactical officers. He kicked his legs and twisted his broad shoulders, trying desperately to fight his way free. But the officers were highly trained and completely unyielding. One officer pressed his heavy knee firmly between Julian's shoulder blades, pinning him securely to the shattered floor. Another officer grabbed Julian's flailing arms and forcefully wrenched them behind his back. "Stop resisting!" the officer shouted over Julian's chaotic screaming. The sharp, distinct metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed loudly through the grand foyer. It was the most beautiful, incredibly satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. "Get off me!" Julian screamed. His face pressed hard against the cold marble, his expensive silk bathrobe torn and twisted around his shoulders. "Do you know who I am? I am a millionaire. I will sue every single one of you. I will destroy your careers." The tactical officers completely ignored his arrogant, empty threats. They grabbed Julian by his upper arms and violently hauled him up off the floor. His legs buckled underneath him, and he refused to stand, forcing the officers to practically drag his heavy body toward the shattered front door. I stood perfectly still beside Uncle Harrison, watching the incredibly satisfying cinematic takedown of the monster who had terrorized me for 2 years. The officers dragged Julian out onto the front porch and down the stone pathway. The thick gray morning fog was finally beginning to lift, revealing the absolute total destruction of his public image to the entire neighborhood. Down at the end of the long, pristine driveway, the catering company vans had just arrived to begin setting up for the massive investor launch gala. Dozens of catering staff members, florists, and event planners were standing frozen by their vehicles, holding expensive trays of imported caviar and massive crystal centerpieces. Early morning neighborhood dog walkers from the exclusive gated community had stopped on the sidewalks, their jaws hanging completely slack. They all watched in stunned, absolute silence as the wealthy, charismatic real estate developer was dragged out of his own custom-built mansion in handcuffs, screaming, crying, and thrashing like a rabid animal. They saw the Federal Bureau of Investigation jackets. They saw the flashing red and blue emergency lights. They saw the absolute, undeniable reality that Julian Myers was nothing but a violent, fraudulent criminal. "Chloe," Julian screamed over his shoulder, his voice cracking with sheer hysterical desperation as the officers shoved him roughly toward the back of a marked police cruiser. "Chloe, you cannot do this to me. I built this life for you. You are nothing without me. You are nothing." An officer placed a firm hand on Julian's head and forcefully pushed him down into the cramped back seat of the police cruiser. The heavy metal door slammed shut, cutting off his pathetic screaming instantly. I stood on the front porch, breathing in the crisp, clean morning air. The massive custom-built glass mansion behind me suddenly felt completely, entirely empty. The suffocating dark presence that had haunted its expensive hallways was officially gone forever. I watched the marked police cruiser shift into gear and drive slowly down the long, pristine driveway. The flashing red and blue lights disappeared into the lifting morning fog, carrying the broken remains of Julian's fake empire entirely away. In a matter of minutes, his entire carefully constructed world had turned completely to dust. Uncle Harrison stepped up beside me, placing a strong, warm hand on my shoulder. His presence was steady grounding and profoundly comforting. "You did it, Chloe," he said softly, his voice filled with immense, deep pride. "You survived him, and you stopped him from ever hurting anyone else ever again." I reached up and gently touched the swollen, dark bruise on my jawline. The physical pain was still there, sharp and throbbing, but the deep psychological agony, the constant paralyzing fear was completely gone. I was a 31-year-old pediatric oncology nurse. I spent my days fighting for the fragile lives of vulnerable children. Now, for the very first time, I had finally fought for my own life with the exact same ruthless, unyielding ferocity. I looked up at the rising sun, watching the bright, golden light begin to warm the cold stone of the driveway. The absolute worst chapter of my entire existence had just violently, permanently closed. The monster was locked securely in a federal cage, and my beautiful, quiet, entirely free life was finally, officially beginning. The weeks following Julian's dramatic sunrise arrest were an absolute blur of endless legal depositions, closed-door meetings with federal prosecutors, and the incredibly slow, meticulous untangling of his massive financial web. Without any access to his completely frozen offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Julian could not afford the high-powered, aggressive corporate defense attorneys he had always proudly bragged about to his wealthy friends. He was ultimately assigned a weary public defender, which was a stark, humiliating reality for an arrogant man who had built his entire towering identity on the absolute illusion of limitless wealth and untouchable power. The federal trial was incredibly swift and absolutely brutal. I sat in the front row of the polished mahogany courtroom every single day, wearing my simple, faded navy blue nursing scrubs. I wanted him to see me clearly. I wanted him to look across the crowded courtroom and remember exactly who had silently dismantled his entire fake empire. The pristine audio recording from the hidden burner phone was the absolute final nail in his heavy legal coffin. When the lead federal prosecutor played that crystal clear recording, the entire courtroom listened in stunned, horrifying silence as Julian explicitly, arrogantly confessed to systemic wire fraud complex, money laundering, and brutally assaulting me. I sat perfectly still and watched his elderly parents, who had flown in specifically for the trial, bury their pale faces in their trembling hands, completely unable to deny the monstrous reality of their golden son. The federal judge was a stern, uncompromising woman with absolutely zero tolerance for arrogant, white-collar criminals who terrorized their spouses. She did not show him even a fraction of an ounce of mercy. Julian Myers was formally sentenced to 12 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for the systemic financial fraud and the aggravated identity theft, with significant concurrent time added for the felony domestic battery charges. 12 long, agonizing years behind cold steel bars. He actually cried when the final sentence was read aloud. Real, pathetic, desperate tears streamed down his handsome face as the heavy-armed bailiff placed him in thick steel handcuffs to escort him out. He looked back over his shoulder at me as they forcefully led him away through the heavy wooden doors, but I offered him absolutely nothing. I gave him no anger, no pity, no visible satisfaction, and certainly no validation. He was simply a fading ghost from a terrible past life that I was finally leaving behind. Bethany did not fare much better in the unforgiving eyes of the federal justice system. Her entire legal defense relied completely on playing the role of the naive, ignorant younger sister who had absolutely no idea her holistic wellness brand was actually a massive criminal money laundering front. But the relentless federal investigators easily recovered dozens of deleted text messages where she actively, enthusiastically discussed moving the stolen commercial loan funds to various hidden offshore accounts to illegally avoid federal tax penalties. The judge saw completely right through her loud, performative courtroom sobbing and firmly sentenced her to 3 full years in federal prison for her active complicity in the financial crimes. She shrieked hysterically when the heavy wooden gavel fell, screaming wildly that she simply could not survive in a cramped concrete cell, that she desperately needed her organic green smoothies and her high thread count silk sheets. It was an incredibly pathetic, deeply fitting end for a remarkably entitled parasite who had mocked my grueling nursing shifts while actively spending my stolen money. Because I had worked directly and cooperatively with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and provided the undeniable, crucial digital evidence on that tiny silver flash drive, the catastrophic financial fallout for me was entirely, completely mitigated. The highly trained forensic accountants officially formally cleared my name of the massive fraudulent commercial loans that Julian had illegally secured using my forged signature. My pristine, hard-earned credit score was completely fully restored to its original perfect standing. Furthermore, during the final sentencing phase, the federal judge officially ordered the immediate total liquidation of Julian's remaining legitimate assets. This included selling his sleek black luxury sports cars, auctioning off his extensive collection of expensive imported watches, and seizing the offshore funds the federal authorities successfully managed to legally recover. As direct legal restitution for the marital funds he systematically stole and the severe physical and psychological trauma he repeatedly inflicted upon me, over 2 agonizing years, I was awarded absolute full ownership of those liquidated assets. It was a truly staggering, life-changing amount of money sitting securely in my personal bank account, but looking at the incredible balance did not feel like winning a random lottery. It felt exactly like profound, hard-won justice. The very first thing I did after the exhausting trial officially concluded was put that massive 6,000 square foot modern glass mansion directly on the real estate market. I absolutely thoroughly hated every single square inch of that house. It was a freezing cold, pristine glass cage filled entirely with dark, terrifying shadows and deeply painful memories of my silent suffering. It mercifully sold in less than a month to a young, energetic tech executive who completely fell in love with the towering floor-to-ceiling windows and the sharp, imposing gray stone architecture. I packed all of my personal, meaningful belongings into 3 small, simple cardboard boxes, leaving every single piece of the expensive, restrictive designer clothing Julian had aggressively forced me to wear hanging lifelessly in the massive master closet. I genuinely did not want to take a single physical item that reminded me of the small, terrified woman I had been violently forced to become. I carefully used a small, reasonable portion of the generous restitution money to purchase a beautiful, incredibly quiet 2-bedroom apartment nestled safely on the historic, tree-lined side of the city. It is absolutely nothing like the cold, imposing museum I lived in with Julian. My wonderful new home features warm, original, gleaming hardwood floors, beautifully exposed red brick walls, and a small, charming wrought iron balcony where I happily grow bright red geraniums and fragrant fresh herbs. The gentle morning sun filters beautifully through the large, historic bay windows, casting a warm, soft golden light completely across my comfortable, oversized reading chair in the corner of the living room. It is beautifully modest. It is incredibly, incredibly cozy. And most importantly, it is entirely permanently mine. No one ever yells at me when the evening dinner is 10 minutes late. No one ever viciously criticizes the specific way I iron a cotton shirt. The only pleasant sounds in my peaceful apartment are the soft, comforting hum of the kitchen refrigerator, the gentle, soothing patter of seasonal rain against the historic glass windows, and the peaceful, steady, reliable rhythm of my own free breathing. My demanding career at the local hospital beautifully blossomed the absolute exact moment the suffocating, crushing weight of my terrifying marriage was finally permanently lifted. Without the constant, paralyzing daily exhaustion of endlessly walking on fragile eggshells around a violent, unpredictable monster, I joyfully poured all of my renewed, boundless energy directly into my true professional passion. Exactly 6 months after the federal trial concluded, the hospital administration officially promoted me to the highly respected position of senior charge nurse for the entire bustling pediatric oncology ward. I now proudly, independently oversee a large, dedicated team of 20 incredible nurses, actively training them to consistently provide the absolute highest standard of compassionate medical care to our incredibly brave, fiercely resilient young patients. I no longer have to carefully hide my dark, bruised arms under thick, long sleeves during the hot summer months. I no longer have to frantically apply heavy, thick theatrical concealer in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the hospital bathroom before my grueling 12-hour shift officially begins. I walk the sterile white hospital corridors every single day, with my head held extremely high, my posture perfectly straight, and my joyful spirit entirely, completely unbroken. The sweet, vulnerable children I care for look up to me with genuine affection, and for the very first time in my entire adult life, I actually truly feel entirely worthy of their innocent, trusting, beautiful smiles. I am certainly not navigating this beautiful, exciting new chapter of my life completely alone. My wonderful Uncle Harrison has organically become the permanent, fiercely steady, emotional anchor in my entirely new world. He officially permanently retired from his long, stressful career in law enforcement consulting and happily bought a small, comfortable house just 10 short minutes away from my new, historic apartment. He drives over to my place every single Sunday morning for a long, leisurely breakfast. I always enthusiastically make us a huge stack of thick, fluffy blueberry pancakes and brew a pot of incredibly strong, dark roast coffee. We sit together quietly on my small wrought iron balcony, happily watching the bustling city slowly wake up, talking deeply about everything and absolutely nothing at all. He never treats me like a fragile, broken victim who barely survived a terrible, unimaginable trauma. He consistently, respectfully treats me like a strong, incredibly capable, independent woman who bravely fought a truly grueling war and emerged completely, utterly victorious. During our very last Sunday breakfast together, he looked at me carefully over the rim of his warm ceramic coffee mug, his piercing, intelligent gray eyes softening with genuine, unmistakable pride. "You look truly incredibly happy, Chloe," he said, his deep voice carrying the rough, familiar warmth I have grown to love and rely on so much. I took a deep cleansing breath of the crisp, cool morning air, looking around my peaceful, incredibly sunlit sanctuary. "I am Uncle Harrison," I replied truthfully. A massive, genuine smile spreading across my face. I really, truly am. The complex emotional healing process has certainly not been perfectly smooth or completely linear. There are definitely still occasional long dark nights when a sudden, unexpectedly loud noise makes my heart race frantically, or a specific lingering brand of expensive dark cologne on a random passing stranger makes my stomach clench violently with residual terrifying panic. Severe psychological trauma leaves deep, invisible, complicated scars that naturally take a significant amount of gentle time to fully, properly fade. But I definitely no longer live my life hiding in the dark. I am actively, enthusiastically attending professional therapy twice a week, actively learning how to completely, permanently dismantle the deeply ingrained toxic belief that my inherent worth is somehow tied to how much extreme pain I can silently endure for someone else. I am slowly, carefully, beautifully learning exactly how to implicitly trust my own sharp instincts again. I am joyfully, fiercely rediscovering the simple, quiet, wonderful joys of daily life that Julian tried so incredibly hard to violently beat out of my spirit. The incredibly sweet taste of fresh, ripe strawberries from the bustling local weekend farmers market. The comforting, heavy feeling of a thick, warm, knitted blanket on a freezing, dark winter night. The absolute, unparalleled, profound luxury of turning the brass lock on my own front door and knowing with absolute, complete, unwavering certainty that I am completely, permanently safe inside my own home. If you are watching this right now and you are constantly, painfully shrinking yourself to desperately survive a terrifying monster, please listen to me very carefully. Remember that your beautiful, deep kindness is absolutely not a weakness. It is the very profound, powerful thing that will eventually give you the incredible, undeniable strength to finally walk away. Love is not a brutal, exhausting transaction where you constantly have to pay with your own precious sanity and physical safety. True healthy partnership is built entirely on mutual, unwavering respect, not relentless, cruel exploitation. You absolutely do not have to stay hidden in the dark, terrifying background to be considered a good, loyal partner. And you certainly absolutely do not have to set your own beautiful soul on fire just to keep someone else warm. When you finally proudly realize your own incredible, immeasurable worth, the toxic people who were aggressively taking constant advantage of your bright light will desperately call you selfish, crazy, or bitter. Let them say whatever they want. Your incredible, profound peace, your unwavering personal dignity, and your bright, beautiful future are worth infinitely far more than the cheap conditional approval of people who only ever loved exactly what they could violently extract from you. Drop a comment if you have ever had to bravely, fiercely take your own beautiful life back from an abuser. Hit that like button, subscribe for more incredible stories of surviving and truly thriving. And remember, you are never, ever as trapped as they desperately want you to believe.